Chapter 22 Crisis of Change. Year 0002, August 11th. Midgar glittered in the distance, a bright blotch against the night sky. Sephiroth had ranged out far enough that the darkness had swallowed the city's details, though he could see the vivid green columns of the Maka reactors firing, could smell the electric tang of it when the wind blew just right. Never far before the invisible leash would tighten, choking, and drag him back to the damnable place. And yet tonight he'd ranged further out than he had ever before on one of his jaunts. Not a mission, just out of the city, training, but it wasn't. The pack of Calmfangs that prowled the wasteland provided no challenge to him. He'd left the ones he'd encountered behind as nothing more than gore, streaked across the ground, scored by Masamune's deadly blade. Stone crunched beneath his boots as Sephiroth walked steadily up a slight incline. He shook frost from the tips of his gloves. By midday tomorrow, the ice he'd been using against the monsters would be melted. His materia practically hummed within his bracer as he lashed the same hand out and hurled a frozen spear at the Calmfang attempting to pounce on him from atop a nearby rock formation. It yelped and gurgled, the spear straight through its throat. The pack was starting to waver, and Sephiroth felt his face contort. The monsters broke formation in a smattering of high-pitched cries as they turned tail. Sephiroth gave them a few seconds before he put on a burst of speed and gave chase. He twisted Masamune in his grip, felt the eerie ring of the blade, as if it were vibrating in his bones. It didn't take him long to catch them, and it took even less to turn Masamune in his grip and cut one of them in two. Another slash, and he beheaded the second. He pushed off, propelling himself above the Forerunner, and came down. Masamune speared through the beast, along the spine, and out through the ribcage. Sephiroth landed beside it. Masamune stuck straight through the beast, and into the parched earth below. His mouth curled into a sneer, and he pressed down, twisted, then braced his boot against the carcass and ripped the blade free. The squelch of flesh, the spill of blood, and the thrill of it, of victory and squashing something less powerful than him, of knowing he'd conquered, should have been satisfying. It wasn't. A reason. He stared down at the carcass dispassionately. There had never been much to be gained from fighting such weak enemies. There was no challenge, but at least in the past he'd garnered a modicum of satisfaction. Now there was nothing but the blood darkening the soil and running down Masamune's long blade. He turned on his heel and began to walk once more, pace inexorable. A reason to fight. What, he said, testing the words on the air, other reason is there? The woman, Elfe, had said she was victorious in retreating, and now Cloud had echoed that sentiment. Sephiroth couldn't fathom it. To fight was to bring power against the enemy. It was to strive to be victorious. Retreat, while advantageous at times, was never a victory. It implied ground given. It implied loss. It implied weakness. He'd been taught all his life that the only victory worth striving for was absolute. My reason. He'd never given it any thought. Even after that encounter, it had been something he brushed aside as meaningless. What did it matter? In the end, it was likely an attempt to distract, Just words to make their utter and complete routing seem palatable. He'd seen it over and over again, the way the military would attempt to boost the men's morale when they faltered. It was human nature to grasp at whatever lifeline they could find. Sephiroth had stopped doing that when he was very young. Being a realist, recognizing where futility lay and where advances could be made, had always served him far better. It served him now, as he found himself testing the boundaries, pushing where he could. He stopped walking and listened to the faintest sound of blood dripping off the end of Masamune's long blade. Just ahead of him, the wastelands finally gave way to grass, far enough away that it was little more than a different-coloured smear against the blue-grey of the night. His night sight, he'd been told, was uncommonly good, even for a soldier. No doubt something to do with his unique eyes. The itch for violence still coiled beneath his skin. It was a release to come out here and just let himself be. This was what he knew, had always known for as long as he could remember. This was simple. This didn't have the capacity to order him with condescending words and smug security. This, out here, couldn't lord over him as if it were somehow better. His hate for the man, for the president, had started young and stayed with him all these years. It bit at him now, an urge that burned like acid at the back of his throat. How easily he could destroy them all. But he hadn't, not yet, and maybe he never would. If you knew how much I've wanted you dead, you wouldn't be so smug. Sephiroth's lips curled back, and he brought Masamune up before slamming the blade into the ground. He let go of it, leaving it to quiver there as he narrowed his eyes at the horizon. My reason to fight is because I exist. What other reason did he need? What other reason was there? It was the same reason he stayed at Shinra, at Midgar. He was tethered to Shinra's machinations, just as certainly as he was molded by its program. He did not fight for Shinra because he believed in the company's policies, or what it stood for. In the end, none of that mattered to him. He sought one challenge after another. Even his rivalry with Genesis had been about testing strength, about challenging one another to see where weakness lay. There had been friendship there, he supposed, but in the end, it had been about Genesis's want to prove himself, and Sephiroth hadn't cared to dissuade him. It had been enjoyable, the time he spent with them. He hated to think on it, hated the sharp feeling it drew from him, like a fresh wound. His hand rose to touch his cheek. The last time he'd felt the sting of a blade wound had been on the slopes of Fort Condor. Small though the cut had been, it had healed quickly, but the sharp sting of it lingered in his memory. Even Genesis had never managed. Occasionally, he had singed the tips of his hair, but never. More than anything, right then, he hated all of it. Shinra and his company, Hojo and his imbecility, the blight that was Midgar and its entire population. Everything. More, he hated Cloud's strife for the inexplicable, inexorable way he was drawn to him time and again, despite himself. It almost felt as if he had no control of the whim. He hated the way the boy could keep pace with him in anything, from discussing materia to swordplay. the way that he seemed to be able to read him. Sephiroth hated the almost knowing way that Cloud looked at him sometimes. "You're lying." He hated that he couldn't figure him out. That for all Cloud seemed to so easily pick him apart, he seemed to lose ground more often than he gained it. He hated that he would go so far in his attempts to keep Cloud out of other people's hands, that his reasoning, as logical and sound as it had been, was becoming mired. I should have killed him when I had the chance. Hadn't he learned his lesson with Angeal and Genesis? With Zack, even? Zack, who was something else entirely. Zack and Cloud, a steadfast pair, as much as Genesis and Angeal had ever been. He hated that as well, seeing them reflected back at him whenever he heard talk of the two. He hated that they got the soldiers to reminiscing, hated how casually and easily they fit into each other's lives and drifted in and out of his. He should be done with all of it, but time and again he made concessions. Time and again he'd gone out of his way. And for what? At this point, Sephiroth wasn't even certain. It may well be nothing but a farce. His certainty that Cloud knew something, had something to do with him, may well be nothing but a fool's whim. Still, he couldn't shake the idea that he was right. As much as he hated it, as much as he wished to ignore it, they were on a similar level. Cloud matched him, and he hated it, and thrilled in it. The horizon caught his attention again, and Sephiroth considered it, sweeping his gaze along the panorama, a dark stretch of land spilling off into the distance. Zack's words chewed at his mind. He made it seem so simple. Just walk away from Shinra. It was laughable at best. Yet as Sephiroth stared at that horizon, there was a part of him that wondered what would happen if he just kept walking. Shinra would, he knew, send a team after him. More than one, again and again. They'd never let him just walk away. They wouldn't let any of their precious commodities, and he was one of their most valuable. An asset they couldn't just release from their greedy clutches. More than that, he had no reason to. It struck him that his bindings were, in the end, partially of his own machinations. Sephiroth wrapped his hand round Masamune's hilt, though he moved no further. His rage was beginning to quiet, the hate sinking slowly back down, and a more contemplative mood overtaking him. Maybe, if he'd let himself pursue Angeal and Genesis, things would be different. He breathed out slowly and yanked Masamune free of the ground before turning and heading back towards Midgar. There was nothing for that line of thought. It was something that had long ago passed. Now, he simply had to figure out where he stood on the concept. At least he no longer felt as if he'd run the president through if he so much as looked at him. And he had no doubt the man was expecting him to report to him yet. Sephiroth slowed his steps. He would continue this small rebellion. Besides, Veery would need to be taken out to run before he settled in for the night. The president would simply have to come to terms with the fact that Sephiroth had other things to attend to, and the meeting had slipped his mind. Year 0002, August 12th. His entire life, Cloud mused, could be divided into all the different kinds of headaches he'd suffered. When he was young, he'd often been plagued by the stuffy-headed, sharp, throbbing pain that came after crying for too long. Later, once he'd been introduced to the joys of various kinds of travel, he'd discovered all the ways one could feel like their head was trying to detach itself from their neck, all while having it pound like a marching band was having a parade across their brain. Once he'd gotten his enhancements, normal headaches had been a thankful thing of the past. The only problem is, they were replaced by worse torment, caused by overdoses of Mako. Painful memories he couldn't forget, and a hateful mind sinking into his own. Right now, Cloud was positive the near-constant pulsing ache that had plagued him since yesterday was a case of the latter. It was draining, having to pretend everything was... Well, nothing was fine, not anymore, but Cloud had pretended normalcy for Zack's sake, even as he felt the rise and fall of Sephiroth's burning hatred tremble at the back of his mind. He had to. He couldn't let his friend know how much it felt like they'd already failed. He'd been hopeful before that their tentative connection with Sephiroth had been going well, but this sudden influx of hatred made him realize just how much Sephiroth kept himself in check all the time. It was a slap to the face, a wake-up call that they might still be failing. They might have already failed. A cold shiver worked its way up Cloud's spine. He was so afraid that the dark thoughts seeping into his consciousness would dig deeper, that Sephiroth would know. He kept that feeling to himself. He couldn't let Zack know, not when Zack was leaving, being forced to leave. Telling him would just cause Zack impotent worry, unable to do anything from his sunny exile. Or Zack might do something rash, and Cloud wasn't sure he could say no if Zack suggested they crash the party now. He stood at Zack's side, on the sidelines of the landing zone, as they waited for the helicopter that would take Zack on his vacation. Giving Zack a sideways look, Cloud felt a pang of sympathy, tinged with guilt. He did want to tell Zack about Sephiroth, but... There were tired lines around Zack's eyes that hadn't been there a few days ago, and a frown tugged at the corner of his mouth as he stared blankly off into the distance, lost in thought. Zack was already so run down, and maybe time away would be good for him. He'd thought the last night had done Zack some good, just relaxing together, both of them knowing it might be the last bit of peace they had together. Cloud touched the new earring fondly. It had been an unexpected gift, but such a Zack thing to remember Cloud's birthday. It was important to Zack, and therefore he made it important to Cloud too. For that reason alone, Cloud had done his best to ignore what could have only been Sephiroth's anger throbbing through his mind. He didn't know what had stirred up such ire, though he had his guesses. Hojo had never been a fond subject of Sephiroth's, and the spike of murderous intent Cloud had received when they'd been in front of the president had left little to the imagination as to what had set him off. Cloud was more surprised at how long the fit had lasted. Hours after Cloud had returned to his apartments, the physical feeling of Sephiroth had finally died away, but the pain in Cloud's temples refused to lessen despite him having slept a few fitful hours.
It's his own fault. No one asked him to step in.
Cloud was thankful Sephiroth had stepped in, though.
Whatever agenda Sephiroth was pursuing worried him somewhat, especially if it left Sephiroth in such a mood afterwards. But just this once, just because Cloud had been ready himself to attack Hojo to get away, he was thankful. A brisk breeze whipped past him just then, cool with the pre-dawn chill. It rustled through Cloud's hair and caused him to duck his chin into his scarf for warmth, which only served to remind him of his upcoming uniform change. His promotion, forced promotion, he reminded himself, still left him sour and irritated, though by now resignation was settling in as well. Maybe he hadn't earned it. Maybe he never would feel like he could earn it. But it didn't have to mean anything to him. Shinra meant nothing to him. Only his friends' opinions. Zack's, Aerith's, even Sephiroth's. People who mattered to him. They were the only ones he cared about. Things were rough with Aerith right now, though Cloud hoped, that they'd work through it. What he worried was that the broken trust would change where they stood. Zack and Aerith, him and Aerith. Cloud loved her and would support her even if she decided they couldn't reconcile. He'd lost her once, and losing her again would hurt. But it would be so much better if it was her own decision. Zack, though. Cloud didn't want to think of what losing Aerith would do to him. Part of him knew it was his own mind making things seem worse than they were, building expectations and imagined reactions that painted him in the worst light. He'd done it to Tifa, to all of his friends. Knowing didn't make it any easier to stop the thoughts, however. All he could do now was trust his friends and to stay, even though Zack had to go. The sound of helicopter rotors could be heard in the distance now, approaching, and beside him Zack shifted. He brought his hand up to rest on Cloud's shoulder and squeezed.
"Looks like it's almost time,"
he said with a worn smile. "It is," Cloud agreed, though even he wasn't sure if he'd meant Zack's departure or other things. Zack straightened his shoulders and locked his eyes on the incoming helicopter, his smile falling away to a grim line. Almost absently, he patted at Cloud's shoulder.
"You gonna be okay?"
Tilting his head, Cloud stared at Zack for a few moments as he considered. Would he? Zack was leaving, and part of Cloud feared he'd never see his friend again. That this was some Shinra plot that they were walking blindly into. Then there was Sephiroth, his strange actions that almost made it seem like there was a chance that Cloud could reach, which was coupled with the knowledge that it didn't seem to be enough to stem the hatred inside. Cloud wanted it to work so much, but he was so afraid. He couldn't let fear control him, prevent him from trying. He'd dishonor the memory of Tifa, of Marlene, of Denzel, all of his friends, and everything they'd done to support him. It was his turn to be strong, to see the plan he and Zack had begun to the end. "I am," he replied softly, confidently. Smiling thinly, he nodded at Zack. "And you?" After a pause, Zack huffed out a breath.
"Yeah,"
he said.
"I didn't come this far to let a little vacation kill me."
Chuckling, Cloud's smile came a little easier.
"At least they didn't send you up north."
Zack gave a full body shudder,
Don't even joke about that. I'm no mountain hound like you.
Humming, Cloud's eyes trailed up to the sky where the helicopter approached, the black dot now a discernible shape, with its rotors whirling and carrying it closer and closer. He sighed, looking back down.
Stay out of trouble. You too.
Zack said, voice deceptively light.
It's just fun, sun, the beach, the waves, and relaxation for me.
And missions, fighting, and Sephiroth for me. Cloud countered, rolling his eyes.
I think I have the better deal, don't you? Honestly, yeah. This is going to suck.
Blowing a breath that ruffled his bangs, Cloud regarded Zack quietly. He wondered if he should ask about Aerith, or if bringing it up would only reopen the fresh hurt. The decision was taken out of his hands. The wind began to kick up as the helicopter hovered overhead, preparing to land. Talking now would be impossible unless Cloud wanted to shout, and the effort wasn't worth it. Instead, he reached out an arm, Zack mirroring his move at the same time. He grasped Zack's forearm warmly, holding the grip as he tried to convey how much he'd miss his friend, how he hoped things would turn out right. So many times in his life, he'd been saved by a hand reaching out to him. He hoped now he could help Zack as well. Zack gripped his arm tighter, then tugged Cloud forward into a tight hug. Cloud felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't want Zack to go, but they had no choice. Pushing back, Zack mouthed at him, "I'll be back before you know it," before he released Cloud to hoist his bag onto his shoulder. Turning, he tossed a wave over his shoulder as he trotted off, the helicopter just touching down on the landing pad as he did so. The moment Zack disappeared inside, it took off again, accelerating rapidly as it flew out of sight. The image of Zack's back as he walked away stayed in Cloud's memory for a long time afterwards. By the time Cloud moved to leave the landing bay, the sun had risen and workers had begun to swarm the area, going about their daily tasks. Cloud ignored them as he made his way out of the area, heading past the soldier compound into the streets of Midgar. It should have been no different than any other day where Cloud ventured out without Zack in tow, but it wasn't. The knowledge that his friend was gone, wouldn't be there waiting at the apartment, wouldn't pop out to drag Cloud off on some errand or another, burned dully in Cloud's chest. The longing was a familiar sensation, but this time it wasn't his own doings that was depriving him of what he wanted. Instead, Cloud was once again letting someone else dictate his life, letting Shinra do it at that. The feeling chafed so much more without Zack to distract him. A sharp feeling of anger bloomed in his chest. He clenched his jaw hard enough to creak in reaction, because he couldn't tell anymore if it was his own or something coming from Sephiroth. He was tying himself up in knots in his head, and there was no one to pull him out of it this time. Abruptly he forced himself to relax, and he tugged at his scarf in an attempt to distract himself. Even if Zack wasn't there, that didn't mean they weren't still in this together, working towards a better future. It didn't mean Cloud was alone. There was still Kunzel, who'd always proven to be a reliable partner and conspirator. Gibbs had proven time and again that he'd stand at Cloud's side, even if he didn't know what the stakes were. Perhaps he would also stand against Shinra, if it came down to that. Any of them from the unit, seemed to have a certain dissatisfaction with the way things were, a hunger for things to be better. And there was Aerith. That was another complication that Cloud wasn't quite ready to confront. He was afraid to see her now that she knew about him. It felt like something had changed. He was scared of that change, that she wouldn't view him as she did before, that something was broken beyond repair. Coupled with her anger towards him and Zack for hiding it from her, he didn't know if he could face her. Maybe he was avoiding her so he could pretend it wasn't going to end. Logically, he knew it wouldn't, but his head kept repeating scenarios where she gave him a flat, closed look and walked away, where her warmth was forever out of reach, not through death, but through his own actions. He wasn't ready to face her on his own, and now Zack was gone. He paused at the end of a quiet street, people passing in front of him in a low murmur of activity. Sighing, he leaned against the wall, rubbing absently at his chest as he stared into space. He admonished his thoughts. It was still Aerith, still the kind friend he'd grown to love over the last year. But the fear wouldn't leave him that somehow that night had damaged their relationship, Aerith, Zack, and his, and it wouldn't be the same. It shouldn't be the same, though. He wasn't the person she thought he was, and she would have to get to know him in the same way he'd had to get to know her, instead of his memories of her. Now that the secrets had been cleared between them, most of the secrets, he amended, she could move forward with confidence. It scared him, but he was so happy to see her grow into the person he knew she could be. He would go see her eventually, even if he wasn't sure she wanted to see him just yet. Leaving things alone, running away, he'd learned by now that that wouldn't fix anything. If he wanted, and he did, then he would have to take the first move this time. Not now, though. He blew out a breath, ruffling his bangs, then stepped back into the swirling people as he made his way back to Shinra Tower. Now he had another distasteful task ahead of him. He didn't have a choice but to do what was ordered. His promotion. A sham was what it was, and a bitter pill to swallow. It was a failure on top of all his others, to be lauded with the rank when he was such a fake. He tilted his head consideringly. Well, maybe fake was no longer the word for it. Before, when he'd stolen the other Zack's skills and memories and played at being a soldier, it had been a rank he hadn't earned, hadn't deserved. It wouldn't have been so bad if it hadn't been tied to his dead friend's memories, or rather, his lack thereof. That was the crux of it, that Cloud had never been able to get this Zack to understand. He didn't want to be in Soldier, because it represented his failed dreams. Cloud had never been good enough for Soldier. As a trooper, he'd failed to get into the program. The Cloud that had been good enough for Soldier had been Zack. Cloud had failed in being able to face the world, so he'd hidden behind Zack's memories. When Geostigma had hit, Cloud had failed his family again. Renault's mocking voice still made his fists clench in annoyance. What Soldier meant to him was failure, not the pride and dreams Zack spoke of, that everyone else aspired to. So while he may have the skills and aptitude to be in Soldier now, However political the promotion was, he would never want it. Plus, it was tied to Shinra, and Cloud had long since lost any desire to want to impress them. Cloud's feet found the familiar path through Shinra lobby to the elevators, and he pressed the button for the soldier floor. There were a couple of businessmen who entered with him, but they got off the elevator on lower floors, and he wasn't stopped further until he reached the desired floor. When he stepped into the lobby area, he paused briefly and blinked in surprise at the number of soldiers already there. Most of them stopped what they were doing at his entrance, and he recognized many of the seconds and thirds who had joined Zack and him in the training fields. No one said anything, so somewhat leery of the attention, he continued through the room towards the briefing area and the deployment pods where he knew his new uniform was waiting. Even Kunzel was in the room, though he looked up only briefly from his phone to wave at Cloud. Maybe a fresh batch of missions had come in? He hadn't heard, but he and Zack had both been preoccupied by Zack's departure. The briefing room was empty, and after checking his phone messages to see which pod he was to check, he found the correct one and pressed the button to open. The damning blue color glared up at him, and his lips twisted into a brief scowl at the familiar cut and style. How long had he worn such a similar uniform? Not knowing, not remembering. Sighing under his breath, he finally collected the uniform, accessories neatly piled underneath it. He supposed he'd have to wait until he'd returned to the apartment to change. Not that he was in any rush to do so. Now that Lazard was gone and Heidegger in charge, he'd avoided checking in with the upper management until he was specifically called. After their last encounter, Cloud doubted Heidegger was in any rush to see him again either. Exiting back into the main lobby area, Cloud was brought up short, shocked at the roar of excitement that greeted him. Apparently, the soldiers had been waiting for him to return with the official uniform before they piled around him, loud words of congratulations tumbling from them.
Not that we didn't think you were one of us already, but now it's official,
Luxia said, clouding Cloud hard enough on the back to make him stumble forward a step. Russell nodded from Cloud's other side, beaming wide enough to break his face.
Zack is such a great teacher, right? It's not surprising you'd be accepted into Soldier after having him train you so closely.
That almost made him roll his eyes, but he refrained as he clutched the bundle of clothes to his chest. He ducked his chin behind his scarf and tried to fight back the embarrassed flush that was heating his face. It wasn't unexpected that word of his promotion had spread, not with the Turks' invasion of the soldier compound. He just hadn't expected it to matter so much to the other soldiers. Almost unwillingly, he felt a tiny spark of pleasure, of accomplishment. It was the same as he'd felt the first time he'd sparred with Zack, like he was being recognized, and there was still a small part of him, almost buried over the years of bitterness and disappointment, that still longed for that acceptance.
And now you just need to get into your new uniform. Then we can all go out and celebrate.
This came from Edge, his sharp grin belying that friendly tone. Cloud eyed him warily, uncertain if he meant to force Cloud into it if he refused. Gibbs was at Edge's side, though he just chuckled and shook his head at his friend.
Really though, congratulations, Cloud,
he said warmly.
Jen and Gran want us to stop by sometime so they can see you in uniform too. Made me promise to get you there one way or another, so be warned.
He shrugged in a what-can-you-do fashion. The next thing Cloud knew, he'd been lifted into the air entirely as one of the larger seconds. Caffrey, his mind supplied, easily a hand taller than even Zack, and significantly wider. Slower than most of the others in the rank, he relied on the brute strength his size commanded, dumped him over his shoulder. He deftly ignored Cloud's squawk of protest. Cloud lost the grip on his new uniform, though it was rescued from its fall a second later by a grinning Jonas.
"Not letting you get away this time,"
Caffrey boomed, jostling Cloud as he took long strides back towards the briefing room.
"Go on and change already. Make it official."
They hadn't even given him a chance to protest. Not that he really would have. Despite the flare of embarrassment at how easily he was hoisted around, Cloud was more and more amused by the men's enthusiasm. If he thought about it, though, it made some sense. He hadn't heard of anyone being promoted to soldier recently, not since he'd arrived. After so many soldiers had deserted, something he'd only heard about, this was probably the first sign that the soldier program wasn't just being scrapped. Uncertainty for the future, of how long they'd be needed, had probably been plaguing many of the soldiers. It was a bittersweet feeling, though. Cloud knew that soldier would fail, was even working towards that goal, and soon these would indeed be the last. But he knew these men now. He'd trained with them, and they were no longer just faceless enemies. He would find some way to make sure they had a chance to escape Shinra, so that they wouldn't just become fodder for Shinra's wars anymore. His thoughts were cut off abruptly as he was dropped onto his feet and shoved forward through the door to the briefing room. He turned and his uniform was thrust into his arms as the 2 seconds backed out of the room.
"Hurry up, will ya?"
Caffrey said as a final warning.
"Or we'll just bust in and help you out. That'll give the fan club something to talk about, eh?"
The door slid closed with an ominous click. For one long moment, all Cloud could do was stare, baffled at how he'd gotten into this situation. Outside, he could hear the mingle of voices, unintelligible through the thick doors, but still audible. He let out a sharp breath through his nose as he stuck one hand in his pocket, pulling out his cell phone.
"I've already been kidnapped. Word of the promotion spread fast."
Zack might get a laugh out of that, at least. Aware of his limited time, Cloud was halfway out of his uniform already when the phone buzzed back.
"Resistance is futile. Let loose and have some fun."
Letting out a short chuckle at that, he let his dour feeling slip away. There would be time enough for regrets when he was alone. Zack was right. Hopefully he'd be able to take his own advice. They both needed the break. It only took a minute for Cloud to change, hands going through the remembered motions as he buckled everything into place. Purposefully ignoring the resurgence of bitterness, he smoothed down a few stray wrinkles as he kicked at the pile of his trooper uniform. His neck and face felt bare and exposed, and he was already regretting the loss of the scarf in his new position. Movement caught his eye, and Cloud half turned to see a mostly indistinct reflection of himself in the large glass panes separating this room from the inner meeting area. Despite the poor surface, he could see enough of himself to make out the familiar cut of the uniform, memories stirring. Without being able to see the details, he looked as he had all those years ago, when he'd willfully forgotten Zack to protect his own mind, when he'd lived a sham of a life because there was nothing left of his own worth trying for. Only that wasn't true. Tifa had been there. She'd found him when he'd been lost, and on the verge of letting himself succumb to the burning green that threatened to drown him in confusion and grief. It was for her that he'd fabricated the life he had, and it had been her, in the end, who'd shattered that illusion to bring his real self back. Maybe he wasn't as strong as he wished. Maybe he wasn't the hero he longed to be. But he was the person she'd wanted to meet all those years ago. And he'd kept her waiting too long. He let his guilt settle. Cloud had never become a soldier on his own merits. That hadn't changed. He had no interest in Shinra's politics, and was only wearing the uniform as camouflage for his current goals. When he thought about it like that, it made it a little easier to bear. His ruminations were interrupted again by the door sliding open. Jonas's voice carried as he called over his shoulder to the rest of the room.
Nah, he's just admiring himself already.
Cloud turned, leveling a flat stare at the idea that he was that vain. But Jonas ignored it as he snagged the pile of the trooper uniform from the floor.
I'll just take care of this for you, shall I? Oh, here,
he added, tossing the phone that had been on top of the pile back to Cloud.
Hope you emptied the rest of your pockets, because you're not seeing these again.
He was out the door before Cloud could protest, only for it to be immediately filled by Caffrey's bulk.
That's better,
he said, looking Cloud up and down. Again, before he could get a word out, Cloud found himself cornered and hefted easily into the air.
I can walk, you know,
he griped, struggling against Caffrey's grip. It didn't budge.
Yeah,
Caffrey replied, his grin audible in his voice.
But see, you're quick, and I'm not. So I gotta make sure you get to the party, right?
Somewhat resigned to being manhandled until they were satisfied he wasn't trying to get away, Cloud wondered if kicking would deter them at all, or if they'd ignore it as easily as Zack did. Silly question, but at least it would make Cloud feel better. The lobby area was cleared out of everyone except for Edge, Gibbs, and Kunzel, the latter of which made no effort to hide his guffaw at seeing Cloud carried around like a sack. Irked, Cloud reached out as he was hefted past and managed to snag Kunzel's helmet to tug it off. Kunzel blinked at him through messy bangs before he yelped and made a dive for it.
Cloud, you're ruining my reputation. Imagine that,
Cloud said dryly, chuckling when Caffrey helped by spinning out of the way of Kunzel's lunge. Edge gave off a low whistle, arms crossed as he watched the scene with amusement.
Okay, this is officially going down as the funniest shit ever. It would be Cloud who'd get him out of that finally. I'm just wondering why no one else tried it,
Gibbs remarked.
Do it and see what kind of rumors pop up about you,
Kunzel warned, wresting his helmet from Cloud's grip. He put it back on, scowling at them all.
Keep it to yourselves, all right? It's no fun otherwise. Sir?
Edge and Gibbs chorused gamely. Huffing, Kunzel waved towards the far wall where the stairwell door was.
Everyone else is up in the cafeteria. We've commandeered it for the day. Hope no Turks show up to crash the party,
Gibbs added pointedly.
Nah, I hope they do show up. That would make it a party,
Edge countered, following Caffrey into the stairwell. Privately, Cloud thought the Turks were smart enough to know when to keep away, and rowdy soldiers would not be the kind of company they wanted. Renault especially. Raised voices caught their attention as they went up the flight of stairs to the next level up, and they entered the dining area to a cacophony of sound. Along one wall, a row of tables had been set up, bottles littering the surface. There were so many, in fact, that Cloud wondered which bar had been drained of all its stock of alcohol. The rest of the group that had been downstairs was spread out here and there, a few with some drink or another already in hand, and there was a large cluster of them at the other end of the room. Caffrey finally let Cloud down, grinning at Cloud's sour look as he pushed him forward, before he broke off towards the drinks himself. A shout and sudden movement of the group all hitting the floor was followed by the high-pitched whine of a blender, which Cloud could now see had been set up on one of the tables. It was whirring at full speed, the top removed, and cluster of needles were flying out of it and embedding themselves in the ceiling. Thankfully, the spread of destruction stayed mostly contained in that area, and Cloud watched bemused as the soldiers picked themselves off the floor, one or two pulling at a few needles that had gotten through. A disgruntled noise made him look over his shoulder at Kunzel.
Cacti needles in the blender again? I just fixed it. I'm pretty sure I saw someone smuggle in some Marlboro parts, so I'd keep my eye on the microwave myself.
Edge said, pointing through the open kitchen door where another cluster of soldiers had been seen. Kunzel cursed before striding off to intercede the impending disaster. Gibbs slapped Cloud on the back.
Welcome to the rank and file, all official and all. It's too bad Zack couldn't stick around. Didn't hear where he was going on such short notice. A mission? Fair wouldn't have let a mission take him away right when his buddy got promoted.
Edge said derisively. Both turned inquisitive expressions on Cloud.
Vacation,
Cloud said flatly. Edge frowned, while Gibbs's eyes climbed towards his hairline.
Gotcha,
Edge said gruffly.
Well, nothing to be done about it, I suppose. Fair'll take care of himself.
Cloud nodded, eyeing a pair of approaching thirds. Halser and Leo, who'd been promoted to soldier only a year ago, around the same time as Gibbs and Edge. In fact, Edge liked to complain about their careless attitude and arrogance about their enhancements. They liked to team up during the training spars to try and overwhelm a single opponent with their combined strength. Leo, in particular, was often reprimanded for overstepping himself. Now, though, they had an air of mischievousness about them, and Cloud had a good guess what their goal was by the bottles in hand.
Hey, Cloud, welcome. Why don't you join us?
Leo said smoothly, raising his bottle invitingly. Edge grunted beside him, but said nothing to protest. Cloud rather thought he was being deferential to the idea that this was supposed to be a celebration for Cloud, and he shouldn't ruin it with his discontent. Well, Cloud had his own way of dealing with things.
What did you have in mind?
He asked quietly, eyes drifting across the room as he took stock of how many soldiers had their attention on them. Most, as it turned out.
Nothing to be scared of, man. Just a little bit of a drinking contest. You might not know it, being pretty new to all this, but soldiers have a higher tolerance for alcohol.
Leo said smugly, looking as if he was imparting some great gem of knowledge on Cloud. There was a stifled sound behind him, but Cloud didn't turn to see if it came from Gibbs or Edge as he answered.
Is that so? Yeah.
Halser cut in.
I know you've been hot stuff in the training fields, but I bet you hadn't had a chance to test all the changes. I don't know,
Cloud said, deliberately loud. It was a startling change from his usual quiet tone, and he knew he had the room's attention, even as he kept his own on the 2/3.
I can't see it being that much of a difference. I could probably still drink most of you under. You're on!
A second called from the kitchen, and others crowded in close, eager for the game. Leo looked pleased to be the center of it all, though Halser grinned nervously at Cloud.
I need a camera. Do you have a camera? This needs to be documented.
Cloud heard Edge say quietly, presumably to Gibbs. Humming, Cloud said,
Anyone still standing after me is exempt, but losers meet me on the training field tomorrow. Just because Zack is gone doesn't mean you're allowed to slack off."
He looked around, expression neutral, and added,
"Who's in?" "Pass,"
Gibbs and Edge chorused, and this time Cloud did turn to look at them. Edge had a grin fit to break his face, and Gibbs was fighting off chuckles. As the other soldiers readied themselves for the drinking contest, Cloud reflected that all things considered, this wasn't too bad.
Zack watched Junon slowly grow more distant. The helicopter had deposited him there, and then he'd been corralled by Cisne and herded onto a ship headed across to Costa del Sol. It wasn't even a passenger ship of some sort, just a freight ship. The railings were painted a bright yellow with bits chipping away. He scuffed his thumb over one such spot where dull grey metal peeked through. It was like they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. It had taken an idiot bigger than Zack to miss what was going on here. They clearly wanted him out of the way, and it made something fierce and unhappy burn in his chest. He felt stifled and penned in, even as he stood out here under the open air. Restlessly, Zack flicked his phone open and closed. Open and closed. He turned, looking back over his shoulder at Cisne. The wind picked at her bright red hair and her oddly bright coloured clothes. She wasn't wearing anything Turk-like, and that only made him more suspicious. Just taking a vacation too, his foot. Bustersorb was down in cargo bay like luggage. The click-snap of his phone drew his attention back. Junon was little more than a smudge now, and Zack looked down at the lit screen. Cloud's last message and his reply was still open. "I've already been kidnapped. Word of the promotion spread fast. Resistance is futile. Let loose and have some fun." With a motion of his thumb, Zack backed out of it and scrolled through his messages. The only other new one was taglined, "Enjoy your stay at Shinra's premier resort." He'd never opened it. "Fun, sun, and beaches," he said on a sigh. "Yeah, right." He half wanted to chuck his phone into the ocean, but then he'd dive over after it, and they'd think he was trying to make an escape. Zack toyed with his phone, scrolling through old messages and silly photos, then back and forth through his contacts. Eventually he stopped and looked at Aerith's name and home number for several long seconds. Finally, with a gusty release of breath, he hit the button to dial and put the phone to his ear. "Gainsborough residence," Aerith chimed once she picked up. "Hey, Aerith," he said, voice in his throat and pulse pounding. "Zack!" She didn't sound furious, but she also didn't sound as cheerfully welcoming as she had a second ago. Zack started, and his voice stuck in his throat. He swallowed, cleared it, and tried again. "Can we talk?" Aerith let out an audible breath, and he could almost see the pinched set of her lips, the raise of her brows as her temper got the better of her. "This is a conversation we should have face to face, I think." Strangled, Zack said. "I can't. Aerith, I'm on a ship to Costa del Sol for a mandatory vacation." She sucked in another shallow breath, and immediately he felt bad for making her worry. He knew that despite whatever misguided efforts he'd gone about, Aerith knew to fear Shinra's games more than he ever did. He was only just catching up, really. "Yeah, he carried on as blithely as he could. "The boss thinks I'm a bit stressed lately, and a bit of sun and rest will do me a world of good. Figured I'd let you know."
"Zack,"
she said again, voice sharp yet gentle. "I'm sorry," he said, "for being a blathering idiot, for misleading her and keeping her out, for not being there right now when she needed him." Aerith sighed.
I know, she said. Don't do it again, please. Zack was quiet, thinking of his phone ringing as he stared into the blazingly angry eyes of a Bahamut summon, of lying right to her so she wouldn't know he was about to fight some summoned, larger-than-life monster. Looking back on it, he wasn't sure if he was trying to protect her from worrying about him, or protect himself from what she'd think. I won't, he said slowly, voice rough. I promise. Good. Her gentleness made it worse than her anger or her frustration. The soft weight of her words settled into his skin and made him feel a sick sense of shame. He'd been a coward, an idiot, with some noble thought of protecting her like some shining hero. Like he could keep her, this little bit of everything good, locked away in a neat box to come back to when things were too awful. He couldn't deny her the right to open the box and smack him one on the way out. Zack closed his eyes and let his hand hover over them, blocking out the light and the view of the ocean. Quietly, he said, I should have trusted you with this a while ago. I know now, she said, talking over him, and I'm not going anywhere. The steely determination in her tone made him stand a little straighter, made him square his shoulders. Yes, you should have, but what's done is done. I know now. I love you, he said, the words coming out abrupt and sudden, like he couldn't help himself. They tossed them back and forth a few times, affectionate, silly, and happy. This time he felt them down to his very bones. The breath Aerith drew in was audible. Zack, she breathed. He felt suddenly and unaccountably nervous. It was like he'd ripped himself open and simultaneously shoved his foot in his mouth. Zack coughed out a laugh, brushing aside his seriousness. Anyway, you should know... Idiot, Aerith said, cutting him off. He could hear the smile in her voice. I love you, too. Despite how tense he was, how heavy everything weighed on him, Zack laughed. Joy burst in his chest, easing away some of the worry that had been plaguing him. His grin, when he got himself under control, was dopey. Okay, he said. Okay, wow, good. Thanks? Aerith started laughing then, her amusement making him crack up in turn. Really? Thanks? It sounded better than saying me too. You're ridiculous, she said, breath short and catching on more giggles. Now, what were you going to tell me? What? He asked, distracted. She sighed again, sweetly fond and exasperated. When you got nervous, you said there was something I should know? Zack barked another laugh and ran his hand back through his hair, finger-combing the mass it was becoming. Well, it's not every day you profess your undying love for the girl of your dreams, you know? Oh, it's undying now. Of course, absolutely. Aerith gave another little laugh, followed by a sigh. Zack. Right. He blinked, trying to wrestle his giddy excitement into some sort of order. Cloud was promoted to soldier just before I was shipped off. 3rd class. Oh, she said, and Zack hummed in agreement. Should I be happy or upset? I went for both, but Cloud came down on the unhappy side, so... Zack let his head hang over the railing again. Down below him, the wake of the ship spread out into the distance, quickly swallowed up by the swell of the ocean. The horizon looked really distant out at sea. Just do me a favour and keep an eye on him for me? The soft, almost put-out sniff Aerith gave nearly sent him back into laughter. I was planning on doing that anyway. As if you would need to ask, honestly. Yeah, okay, he said, grinning again. He glanced over his shoulder at the sound of someone clearing their throat. Cissnei smiled her quiet smile at him and tilted her head in inquiry. I better go.
he said to Aerith, not looking away from Cisne. "My new beach buddy wants to hang out." "Okay," Aerith said, humming. "Stay safe and try not to get into too much trouble. Love you." Zack didn't bother to tamp down the bright grin when it reappeared. "Love you too," he said, and disconnected the call. Cisne stepped up to lean on the railing next to him. "Made up with your girlfriend?" she asked lightly. "More than," Zack said. Then, "Wait, how did you—" "It's hard to miss after you sulked to an entire bar," she said, friendly and ruthless at the same time. "At least you won't be there for the fallout of the rumors." Year 0002, August 16th.
It took a few days longer than Cloud anticipated, but he wasn't surprised when he was accosted on his way from Shinra Tower one day by Sparrow, Jack, and Connolly.
"There he is, all high and mighty,"
Sparrow said, grinning toothily down at Cloud.
"Sporting fancy new threads, too." "You're just jealous,"
Jack said, elbowing Sparrow's side. Connolly shook his head, trailing slightly behind the other two, but he smiled at Cloud easily.
"Congratulations, Cloud. I'm glad to see one of us made it."
His smile turned slightly wan.
"I know you always wanted to make Soldier. Not quite the way you anticipated, though, was it?"
It had been a while since Cloud had had a chance to hang out with them. To be honest, he found he'd missed the simplicity. Despite how welcoming the soldiers had been, despite how much there was to do with what was normal duties for a third, Cloud had felt somewhat detached these last few days. He chalked it up to Zack's absence and the gaping feeling of emptiness that never quite faded away. The other soldiers were too Shinra, was the only way he could put it. They'd been through the system, had been changed by Mako and the soldier procedure. And there was just a feeling of focus and routine all centered around the company. Even on the off hours, soldiers lived for battle. It was wearisome. The regular troopers didn't have that. They had goals outside of work. Lives they lived in their spare moments. Shinra was their means to an end, with family businesses and normal lives waiting for them when they were done serving. Sometimes Cloud needed a reminder that there were things out there besides the company. And just in time, these three appeared.
"It's good to see you again,"
Cloud said honestly.
"Got some time to kill? It's our day off."
Connolly asked, gesturing abortively at their out-of-uniform status. That was another difference. Cloud didn't think any of the soldiers even owned civilian clothes anymore. True to Jonas's words, Cloud hadn't seen a scrap of his trooper uniform since that day. Sparrow hiked an arm around Cloud's shoulders before he could answer right off.
"Or don't you have time for us lowly troopers anymore?"
Rolling his eyes, Cloud shoved the arm off.
"Don't be stupid. I'm off for the day as well."
Clucking his tongue, Sparrow held his hand up placatingly.
"Touchy. Good to see you're not the emotionless robot you used to be, at least." "Hey, Sparrow, that's not fair,"
Jack protested. He turned an earnest expression on Cloud, who was more amused at the accusation than offended.
"He didn't mean it, Cloud. He's just been in a bad mood since that Turk lady stopped answering his calls. I keep telling him she's probably just busy, but—" "And that is none of anyone's business but mine,"
Sparrow said, whacking Jack upside the head none too gently. Cloud raised an eyebrow, keeping his concern off his face. Since the Turks were watching them closely, it wasn't out of the possibilities that one had cozied up to Sparrow in an effort to get more information. When Sparrow couldn't provide much insight, they might have broken it off for other avenues. However, as Sparrow said, it really wasn't any of Cloud's business, and he didn't want to aggravate Sparrow further by pressing for information. Instead, he turned to Connolly, who was watching the two friends scuffle with a wry expression.
Hungry?
He asked. He had been planning on stopping somewhere to pick up food, the habit ingrained from all the time Zack had dragged him off right after they were off duty as well. Connolly blinked for a moment, before he gave Cloud an odd look he couldn't decipher. Then he grinned.
I think Sparrow's right, though. You have changed. It's a good one.
Cloud didn't know how to respond, so he just waited patiently for Connolly to answer his question. That did cause Connolly to laugh.
But not too much, I see. Yeah, I don't think any of us have eaten yet, and it's late enough for supper. Queen Cafe! I want Sparrow, stop! I'm totally in the mood for their speciality.
Jack said, trying to squirm out of the headlock Sparrow had him in.
Frog legs,
Sparrow said, disgust thick in his voice. He knuckled Jack's head one more time before releasing him.
How can you eat that crap? It's delicious, that's how.
Jack replied.
Cloud agrees, right, Cloud?
Zack likes them. Calls it revenge food. Cloud offered. He himself wasn't a fan either way, but wouldn't object to the restaurant choice. It had an outdoor terrace that was less claustrophobic than sitting in as well.
And I like them too. Looks like you're outnumbered, Sparrow.
Connolly said with a shrug.
Tasteless heathens, a lot of you.
Sparrow muttered, but waved them on down the street.
At least that's not all they sell.
Cloud fell into step beside Connolly, with Jack all but skipping a few steps ahead, and Sparrow dragging his feet behind. The afternoon was warm, though the sun would be setting in the next couple of hours. Down in the streets, the long shadows of the buildings blocked out the direct light, but the golden light shone across the tops of the buildings, still illuminating their path. There was a hint of a winter bite in the air, or maybe it was just Cloud's imagination as the days ticked by and the bone-chilling cold of Nibelheim loomed in the future. Out of the corner of his eye, Cloud noticed Connolly sending him surreptitious looks. It struck him then that this past year must have been strange for Connolly most of all, out of his friends. Cloud didn't remember it, but he had been in Connolly's unit, had in fact been partnered up with Connolly. He'd only realized it during that mission to Icicle, and it had slipped his mind again with all the business with the Raven and other distractions. It must have been as if Cloud had suddenly started ignoring him. Cloud hadn't meant to, of course. He hadn't known. Even if he had, he'd been in Zack's care by then, and there hadn't been much opportunity to meet with his old buddies. A normal person would have tried, though. Did Connolly think that Cloud had deliberately excluded him? Why would he be here now, if that was the case?
Hey.
Connolly's voice broke Cloud out of his ruminations. He turned his head, giving Connolly a questioning look. For his part, Connolly bit his lip, obviously deliberating, before he continued.
Can you tell us what the tests were like for your soldier exam? I mean, if you don't want to talk about it still, or can't, It's fine. Cloud cut him off, frowning to himself. It won't help you much, though. My tests were... The decision had already been made. The tests were just a pretense. What's that? Sparrow asked, stepping up beside Cloud with an interested look in his eyes. They just gave you a pass into soldier, just like that? I'm not surprised, Jack said. Cloud should have been promoted a long time ago. We all know that. It just took the stuff-ups a long time to notice. Right, Cloud? Letting out a derisive breath, Cloud shook his head. I refused it. A few months ago. Jack's reaction was nothing short of volcanic, as he whirled on his heels and shrieked, What? Cloud stopped, so as not to run into him, but just raised an eyebrow at him. But I thought, why would you turn it down? Connolly asked, befuddled. I'm surprised you didn't hear, with how quickly rumours spread.
Cloud said mildly. He ran a hand distractedly through his hair, ducking his shin before he remembered the lack of scarf. Fighting a frown, he continued. They wanted to make me a first right off.
And you turned that down?
Jack demanded, seizing Cloud's arm in his distress.
Why?
Plucking Jack's hand off him, Cloud stepped around him to continue on the way to the cafe.
It wasn't right. I didn't want to be part of an obvious publicity stunt.
Which was also true, along with the myriad of other reasons the jump to first class would have been bad. Third was bad enough. The tendrils of the company winding their way tighter around Cloud, trying to keep him under their control.
Should you be telling us this?
Connolly's hesitance made Cloud pause, looking over his shoulder at the three of them. Jack still looked like the bottom of his world had dropped out, and Sparrow was regarding Cloud with a thoughtful expression. But Connolly was looking around worriedly, as if he expected a Turk to leap out and decry Cloud's words immediately. Cloud shrugged carelessly.
The evening rush starts soon, if we want to get to the cafe in time,
he said instead. He didn't care about Shinra politics, and if any of them asked the right people, they'd be able to piece together most of Cloud's public protest anyway. As much as Shinra tried to keep secrets close, they leaked out in the end. It wasn't like anyone had told him not to talk about it, after all.
No big deal, right?
Sparrows put in with a grin.
See, Jack? There are other people out there just as averse to hard work as you. Hey, I work hard.
Jack protested, shaking off his stupor to punch Sparrow's arm in retaliation.
Only when you have to,
Connolly said, shooting one last worried look at Cloud.
Aren't you trying to be a trooper for life or something like that? It's good pay, come on.
Jack whined.
Soldier is cool and all, but look at all the dangerous missions they had to go on. No, thank you.
It's more dangerous to leave them bored, Cloud added, thinking back on the disaster that had been the cafeteria after the celebration the other night. The drinking contest had been a mere sideshow once it became apparent that Cloud wasn't going down easy, and buzzed soldiers were even more rowdy than sober ones. The microwave had succumbed to whatever foolishness had been going on despite Kunzel's protests, and had been reduced to a melted, misshapen lump at the end of the night. Honestly, Cloud had been somewhat impressed at the creativity they expressed. It was just a pity most of it was organic. It would be days before all the various monster pieces were found.
But man, it would have been so cool if you'd gone straight to first, you know, Cloud?
Jack said plaintively, bringing the conversation back around.
Like, just one of the normal guys able to make it so far.
You know that soldiers were normal guys before, right? Cloud asked dryly. Sparrow cuffed Jack again.
Jack here's got his head too far up his arse to see straight. His head's too full of romance novels, you mean?
Connolly interjected. Jack rounded on Connolly with a yelp.
You said you'd keep that to yourself! Oh ho!
Sparrow had a wicked gleam in his eyes, coupled with a not-so-pleasant grin on his face.
Lady troubles? I seem to remember a very similar conversation earlier. Now what was it? Layla and I haven't been having any troubles at all. She just likes those kind of books, and I thought I'd see what all the fuss was about.
Jack's tone had turned petulant, and he crossed his arms defensively.
We're going on another date tomorrow, in fact. That makes, what, 6?
Connolly asked.
5. She says buying her a bottle of water at work doesn't count.
Amused with the banter, Cloud guided their little group towards the open cafe, content to listen to the simple gossip. He had noticed Layla had been extra perky lately, the occasional times he'd seen her behind the desk, but he hadn't known Jack had been the reason. There was a brief lull in the conversation as they were seated, and drinks ordered, before they were left to their own devices again to wait for their food.
Okay, I am dying to know what you've been up to lately. if turning down a first-class promotion is old news.
Sparrow said, leaning back in his chair. He had the straw from his drink clamped between his teeth and didn't pay any mind to the few stray drops that hit his shirt.
What did Fair think of that? I guess they have you doing separate duties?
Connolly added questioningly.
Usually you don't hear, well, things about just one of you. The troops gossip sometimes.
Leaning on his elbow, Cloud shook his head absently.
Zack doesn't care either way. He's currently on vacation, though. I haven't been doing anything different.
He had, after all, been out on normal soldier missions the entire past year with Zack. By now, he was well aware of how the mission board worked, and had been sure to pick up a few of the third-level missions to keep from stirring up trouble.
What? I thought there was some special ceremony or something to get into soldier.
Jack complained, jabbing a finger in Connolly's direction.
This guy seems to think so, at least. You're saying it's just a pat on the back, congrats, and you're a superpower now?
Cloud snorted at the image.
No, in my case... You know my case is unusual. I was already enhanced, so they didn't need to do anything further.
Even though Hojo had wanted. Cloud pushed the thought back, determined not to think about it right now.
You've been through the test once, haven't you, Connolly? Huh?
Connolly seemed surprised at being addressed, and it took him a moment to respond.
Yeah. Just the preliminary exams, not the real thing. They ran us through an obstacle course to test our physical fitness. I failed to make it to the end.
He shrugged self-deprecatingly.
That's what the regular army's for, though, right? Only an exception can jump right into soldier. Don't remind me.
Jack flopped forward onto the table, rattling the drinks in his melodrama.
I could do without the early morning wake-up calls too, you know? At least it gets your wheezy ass into shape.
Sparrow said unsympathetically. With another shake of his head, Cloud continued.
It's not that much different from the main exams then. Psych test, physical, and medical. Then the soldier procedure, if you pass. Yeah, that's what I'm interested in. I mean, if I ever did get into soldier, I'd want to know what I'm getting into.
Jack waved a hand back and forth, indicating his wavering stance in the idea.
We all know they change them somehow, with Mako. Does it hurt? I don't think I want to take a Mako bath like you did, Cloud. I wouldn't recommend it.
Cloud replied dryly.
Yeah, you and your ridiculous luck,
he said, laughing and pushing back in his chair.
But I guess it has to be something like that, if that's the only thing you missed out on. Not sure I like the idea. That stuff's like poison, right? They wouldn't poison people on purpose,
Connolly countered, and Cloud bit back a sigh at the innocent disbelief. He couldn't exactly correct them either, not without drawing suspicion on all of them.
It is dangerous, and that's why they only take the best of the best.
The conversation paused when the waiter arrived with their food, and they broke off to dig into the hot dishes. Cloud ate mechanically, reminded of Zack again as he bit into the Gongagan specialty. He missed his friend, and the small connection they still had by phone wasn't the same. Zack had been, in his own words,
bored,
and it grated that they'd been handicapped because of Shinra right now. They needed to be prepared to solidify themselves against the upcoming hardship, and it felt like they were now broken and divided despite it all. He tried not to think like that, but he hadn't seen hide nor hair of Sephiroth since that night with Veery. He hadn't even felt anything from him since the burning anger from that other night had finally died down. How was he supposed to keep an eye on him if he was nowhere Cloud could find him? There was always the option of trying the mental link, of following it until he came across the man. But Cloud wasn't brave enough to try that yet. He still wasn't sure that Sephiroth was entirely unaware of it, and after the heavy waves of hatred he'd experienced, He wasn't eager to take another chance unless he had to. It hadn't come to that yet. In fact, if he went by Sephiroth's words, he had an open invitation to pick up Viri sometime. That would give him a small opportunity to see Sephiroth. But in the end, Sephiroth would expect Cloud to go his own way, and that wasn't what Cloud needed to do.
Earth to Cloud! The food can't be that good.
Sparrow's voice cut through Cloud's thoughts, and he blinked as he looked up at his companions. He felt a twinge of guilt as he realized he'd been ignoring them.
That's better,
Sparrow said, grinning toothily across the table.
What?
Cloud asked, having no clue what he'd missed when he'd been lost in his own thoughts.
I just asked what kind of missions they had you doing, if Zack's not with you.
Connolly said, throwing Cloud an apologetic look for Sparrow's brusqueness.
Just cleaning out monster problems, mostly.
It wasn't anything different or interesting. Soldier missions were often boring, repetitive, and only assigned to the stronger units because it was more efficient to send out one operative, rather than many, to take care of a relatively common problem. It was why the soldiers always seemed to be carting around monster parts to play around with. That behavior was more encouraged for material experimentation, but some things could be learned even by a bunch of overpowered children, destroying kitchen appliances as well, such as the relative speed that cactuars shot their needles in a demonstrable likeness using a blender. Taking another bite of his food, Cloud considered the missions he'd accomplished the past few days. There had been an infestation of hedgehog pies in the slums, spanning out of the in-between areas and spilling into Sector 7. That had been a few frustrating hours of chasing them down, mostly, as they were tricky things that liked to slip through the small spaces before he could get to them. There had been a few emergency postings about escaped monsters from the science floors, but Cloud had avoided them. A few of the second-level missions had been for outside Midgar, but he wasn't allowed to take those yet. Snorting, he realized that he'd fallen right into the pattern of a good little soldier, just as Shinra had wanted. Well, he was trying not to make waves right now. He'd done enough of that over the past year already.
That's the majority of the work they have for thirds. Aside from larger-scale missions, there hasn't been anything worth looking into. That's good.
Connolly's voice was hesitant, and Cloud sent him a questioning look.
That's a letdown, you mean?
Jack cut in scornfully.
Is that really all it is, Cloud? I'd rather be stuck on patrols. It kinda is,
Connolly said apologetically.
I guess they just hype it up so much. You'd think there was something more.
Cloud would have responded, but just that moment, his phone gave off a blaring alarm, one of the emergency notifications firing off. It was a soldier SOS, calling any soldier close to the reported area to check in. When he checked, he saw the call was coming from one of the courtyards a few blocks away.
Sorry, I have to go,
he said, flashing his phone in explanation as he stood up. The others stood as well, ignoring Cloud's hand wave for them to remain. Sparrow cupped his hands, giving Jack a leg up over the low wall bordering the restaurant as he asked,
"What's the big hurry about?" "There's a kid. He was climbing up one of the billboards on Crispin Way when it broke,"
Cloud said, reading quickly off his phone as they took off at a run down the road.
"He's hanging on, but they don't know how long he can keep that up. They're requesting a soldier, since no one can reach him safely."
Tugging his phone away, Cloud lengthened his stride. Behind him, he could hear the clatter of 3 other pairs of boots as his friends sped up, keeping pace despite Cloud's lead. Despite the twinge of worry, Cloud was happy for the unasked-for backup. For a while there, he'd wondered if they'd grown tired of him, since he hadn't had much time lately. He might not understand why, but their loyalty warmed him. The moment he entered the courtyard and saw the precarious position the sign was in, he knew he needed to move fast. The billboard was at an angle, one half having come loose of its boltings, and even from here he could hear the creaking of straining metal coming from the other half. It was unlikely to hold under that sort of strain. Unfortunately, the sign was on top of one of the buildings in the area, and a crowd had gathered below on the street level. The boy had seemed to slip off the railway that was connected to the sign, and was clinging to a jutting stone outcrop on the building, arms hugging it for dear life. With no purchase for his feet, he'd lose his grip sooner rather than later. The first thing Cloud needed to do was secure him, but even as he thought it, he heard the sign give another ominous shriek, jutting down a few more inches before it held.
"How well can you climb?"
he called over his shoulder, turning just enough to catch Connolly's eye. Not waiting for an answer, he slid to a stop and clapped his hands as Sparrow had for Jack earlier. To Connolly's credit, though his face paled, he continued running forward without pause and stepped into Cloud's hands. Judging the distance, Cloud heaved, sending Connolly through the air up to where the boy was. There was no time to admire the accuracy of the unpracticed move. Connolly had successfully secured the boy with a better grip, heaving him over the outcrop as he braced himself with other handholds.
"Move out of the way, people!"
Sparrow called, his momentum carrying him right into the crowd milling about, Jack at his side. He began pushing people when they moved too slowly, getting them away from the danger area. Cloud crouched for a moment as he gathered himself, then leaped up at the sign just as the last bolt snapped, and the large slab of metal began to tumble. Sparrow and Jack's efforts had helped, but there were still too many people below for Cloud to let it fall safely. And Connolly and the boy were still in the way. Turning carefully, he shot out a sharp kick as he came up under it, countering the downward fall briefly. Casting an eye down, he saw where Sparrow and Jack were, saw the way they were moving the crowd, then reached out a hand to grasp the nearest edge of the sign. With a grunt, he heaved it down and around, aiming for the widening gap below. The sound of screaming metal and shattering concrete echoed down the street, coupled with the screams of people as they scattered from the epicenter of destruction. Gravity caught Cloud, and he let himself fall, angling himself towards the building as he did so. A second later, he shot out a hand to stop his fall, snagging a handhold a few feet above Connolly and the boy. The noise of the sign's fall died away, and the dust and patter of debris lasting for a few minutes longer.
"And you said being a soldier was boring,"
Connolly complained, only a slight shake in his voice as he grinned up at Cloud.
"No, I just said it wasn't any different from what I did before,"
Cloud corrected, shrugging his free shoulder.
"How is he?"
"I'm fine!" the boy yelled, turning a red, tear-streaked face up at Cloud. It was twisted into a scowl as the boy fought back his obvious fright.
"Well, I'm not,"
Connolly said, shifting his stance slightly. He'd wedged his body against the stone outcropping the boy was draped over, one boot barely holding up against a lower ledge, and he pressed himself as flat against the building as he could.
"I think I'm getting a cramp. Next time send Jack up. Don't run so fast next time,"
Cloud countered, chuckling as he let go of his grip. He snatched the two as he passed them, pulling them off their perches. The boy yelped and kicked at the sudden move, but Connolly again kept his head until they hit the ground. Cloud softened the landing before letting the troopers weight down. He let the boy slide to the ground as well, but didn't let up his support in case he was too shaky to stand on his own. Jack came running up the moment they touched ground, a grin beaming from ear to ear on his face.
"That was awesome! I take it all back. Soldier is the best!"
Shaking his head, Cloud craned his neck up to take in the empty struts where the sign had been. before looking back at the people who were edging back in, now that the obvious danger had passed. You couldn't stop people's curiosity, no matter how dangerous it was, it seemed.
It would have been messier if you hadn't helped,
he said absently. He would have managed, but it was likely there would have been at least some injuries if Jack and Sparrow hadn't cleared out the crowd. He could only split his attention so much, after all. Sparrow thumped Cloud on the back, ruffling his hair mercilessly until Cloud batted his hand away.
It's never a dull moment with you, is it?
The boy still leaned heavily on Cloud's side, so when Sparrow turned to deal with the milling crowd, he left that duty to him. Instead, he turned his attention down, feeling a pang of sadness at the familiar, missed feeling of a small hand clinging so tightly to his own. He pushed those feelings back, though. They'd do him no good now. The boy had his face buried in Cloud's stomach, hand gripping Cloud's arm with no intention of letting go, and was nearly standing on Cloud's boot, he was so close. Sighing under his breath, Cloud used his free hand to tug lightly at the boy's shoulder, loosening the grip so he could crouch down in front of him rather than tower over. Reaching out, he rubbed one gloved thumb over a tear-streaked cheek, checking for himself to be sure the boy hadn't come to harm.
"Where are your parents?"
he asked after a moment, when the boy just regarded him silently. Scowling, the boy scrubbed an arm across his face, shoving Cloud's hand out of the way. His other hand didn't let go of Cloud's, though, so he took no offense.
"Mom's probably at the plaza. She's always there."
Humming, Cloud considered the bitter tone. He didn't know what was going on, why the boy was so far from his guardian, but maybe it wasn't his business. But the very least he could do would be to see he was returned safely. Connolly crouched down next to them and offered a clean handkerchief to the boy.
"What's your name?"
he asked quietly. Around them, Cloud was vaguely aware of Jack and Sparrow taking charge of cordoning off the area around the fallen sign and keeping the people out of their little circle. He appreciated the effort. The kid was shaken enough without strangers crowding around.
"Hugh,"
was the sullen response.
"Well, Hugh, why don't we get you back to your mom then, okay?"
Connolly said, giving Cloud a sympathetic grin when the suggestion caused Hugh to merely cling harder.
"Why? She won't care,"
Hugh protested. He tugged at Cloud's arm, and Cloud felt a bit helpless in the face of the child's tenacity. Connolly looked equally baffled, eyes flicking from Hugh to Cloud and back as he thought. Sometimes, Cloud mused, it was better not to give them a choice. He stood up, pulling Hugh up with him. The boy wrapped his legs around Cloud's waist automatically, though he looked even less happy at the manhandling than he had before.
"Let's get away from here first,"
Cloud said, ignoring that. Connolly nodded as he stood, brushing his pants off. He turned, raising an arm at Sparrow and Jack. The former acknowledging the wave with a nod, though he didn't pause in where he was directing the just-arrived troopers in roping off the street. Cloud strode off in the other direction, pushing past a few curious onlookers as he ducked down a side alley that would take them away from the commotion. Hugh wrapped his arms around Cloud's neck, burying his face in Cloud's collar as he walked. Ignoring the ticklish sensation, Cloud took advantage of him not paying attention to start making his way to the fountain courtyard, the most likely spot the boy had been talking about. It was a popular hangout spot, and he figured Hugh couldn't have gone too far from his mother. Some hurried steps behind him caused Cloud to pause, waiting as Connolly caught up with him.
"Sparrow and Jack have it handled. They'll stick around to take care of the mess,"
he explained, then let out a brief laugh.
"Looks like that cut our time short, huh, Cloud? You gonna have any more free time soon?"
"Maybe," he allowed. Time seemed in such short supply now. How much time did he have? Would Zack be in time? Was there enough time to change anything?
Fair enough,
Connolly said. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the ambient noise of the streets. It was broken again as Connolly began hesitantly.
You know...
Cloud prompted quietly when Connolly paused again. Connolly wrung his hands together, giving Cloud a sideways look, his gaze lingering on Hugh for a moment.
You know you can count on me for anything, right?
Cloud slowed his steps, regarding Connolly quietly for a few moments. Connolly met his gaze without hesitation, an earnest expression on his face, despite his nervous movements. Connolly had been close to him at one point, long forgotten to Cloud's memory, but not to Connolly's. Maybe that was where the loyalty stemmed from, or maybe it was something else. But Cloud believed that Connolly was offering more than just simple obedience to a now obsolete partnership. Giving a faint grin, Cloud freed one hand to reach out and clasped Connolly warmly on the shoulder.
I do know. If you need anything, you only need to ask as well.
It was all he could offer now, but Connolly definitely deserved it.
Thanks.
Connolly looked surprised at that.
Really, Cloud?
His smile was tentative, but genuine. Maybe he hadn't expected Cloud to respond, or to reject the offer. Maybe Cloud would have as well, before, when he was struggling to come to terms with his second chance and everything he gained and lost. Now, Cloud knew where he belonged, and who mattered in the murky waters of Shinra's corporate web. He was willing to fight for that. The rest of the walk to the courtyard was done in silence, but it was a companionable silence. Cloud scanned the area, aware the moment Hugh realized where they were by the way the boy stiffened in his arms. There were several women of the right age in the area, though none looked like they were worried over a missing child. The boy hadn't been exaggerating then, assuming his mother was in the area.
I told you she doesn't care,
Hugh piped up, pushing away from Cloud, so he could scowl across the courtyard at the small group of women. They were seated at a cafe under a wide, colourful umbrella that dotted the outside seating.
Is that why you ran off?
Cloud asked mildly.
Well, yeah,
Hugh mumbled.
I thought maybe she'd notice if I wrote my name up there. It would be so big, she'd have no choice but to see it. But all she ever talks about is Soldier Angeal this and Soldier Angeal that. It's super annoying.
He finished his outburst by giving Cloud a defiant look, as if daring him to object. For his part, Cloud blinked in surprise at the unexpected name drop. It seemed to make no sense in the context of the conversation, and all he could do was send Connolly a confused look. Connolly covered a grin with a hand, chuckling at Cloud's confusion. Clearly he had an idea what Hugh meant, and Cloud bit back an irritated scowl at being out of the loop.
Is she, a fan of Soldier Hewley?
Connolly offered, when he got his laughter under control. Hugh gave a miserable nod, then squirmed in Cloud's arms to be let down. Cloud did so, and Hugh took off at a trot across the courtyard, Cloud and Connolly trailing behind.
Is this like Sephiroth's fan club?
Coughing, Connolly gave Cloud an apologetic look.
They were really popular. I'm not surprised there's still groupies around, even after they left. Mom, I almost got killed a few minutes ago. What do you think about that?
Hugh's voice was clearly audible, even from halfway across the courtyard. Cloud let out a huff of exasperation.
What?
Despite Hugh's opinion, the woman did sound shocked at the news at least. She slipped out of her chair to kneel in front of Hugh, wiping at the messy face with one hand.
What are you talking about, Hugh? You've been here the whole time.
Nuh-uh.
Don't even know what time it is. We've been here for hours. You didn't even notice when I left, did you? You're Hugh's mother?
Cloud asked, breaking into the conversation before the woman could defend herself. She blinked up at him, her eyes briefly taking in his uniform before focusing on his face. Her table companions tittered, though Cloud couldn't fathom why his words had caused such a reaction.
I am? Oh, he didn't cause any trouble, did he, soldier?
She stood up to face him properly, trailing off as she waited for him to fill in his name. He wasn't particularly inclined to.
He got into a bit of trouble,
Connolly said, stepping up to Cloud's side.
We and a couple of other off-duty infantrymen were close enough to help. But miss, you really should keep a better eye on your kid. He could have been seriously hurt in the accident.
A frown crossed her face, and she laid a hand on Hugh's head. For his part, Hugh lit up with a bright smile at the attention.
I see. Well, I'm very sorry my boy caused a soldier any concern. Thank you ever so much for saving him.
She bowed briefly, pushing at Hugh's head to have him bow as well, before looking up at Cloud from beneath her lashes. Frowning, Cloud glanced over at Connolly. He wasn't sure why she was focusing on him when Connolly had been the one talking. Straightening, she took a step closer to Cloud.
You should come sit with us,
she said with a smile. For some reason, it made Cloud uncomfortable, and he resisted stepping back himself. Beside him, he heard Connolly bite back a laugh.
Tell us how you rescued my boy. Hugh, why don't you go get a chair for your hero, will you?
She reached out as if to take Cloud's arm and pull him forward. This time Cloud did react, aware now that she was, well, hitting on him. He never knew what to do in that kind of situation, and so did the first thing that came to mind, and that was to pull Connolly in front of him and take several steps back.
We really do need to get going.
Connolly didn't seem fazed at his new position, and merely smiled at the woman's scowl at Cloud's retreat.
Hugh, you take care not to wander too far from your mother, okay? Keep her in line. Sure thing. I'll keep Mom from getting her claws in Soldier Cloud, too.
Hugh piped up cheerfully, and Cloud could feel his face go red.
Hugh!
His mother cried, appalled.
Good boy,
Connolly said, snagging Cloud's arm to tug him away. Cloud didn't resist, eager to leave the embarrassing scene behind. Just before they got out of earshot, Cloud heard Hugh's mother pipe up one last time.
How am I ever going to get a soldier husband if they're all so touchy? He was perfect.
Closing his eyes, Cloud resisted the urge to kick at Connolly's poorly stifled laughter.
Really, Cloud?
He asked, multicolored eyes glittering with mirth as he took in Cloud's still red face.
Shut up,
he bit back.
Year 0002, August 20th.
A week, Cloud felt, was long enough to wait before seeking out someone as volatile as Sephiroth. Part of him felt it was his duty to keep his eye on what Sephiroth was up to. Zack was counting on him, and even more, Cloud knew he couldn't let things be when they were so close to the pivotal moment. Another part of him was irritated at the entire situation. Since his promotion, Cloud hadn't even heard a rumor of a sighting of the silver-haired man, and for once he'd been listening for it. That was worrisome, especially so close on the heels of the surge of anger from before. However, as time passed, the stiff tension of anticipation drained away, leaving Cloud aggravated and adrift as nothing happened. He'd been somewhat afraid that it had heralded an early start to Sephiroth's downfall. He'd been desperate enough at a point where he'd even lowered his defenses briefly, reaching out with that other sense as he tried to determine what Sephiroth was up to. Aside from the slight mental buzz and a vague idea of where Sephiroth was, Cloud learned nothing from that attempt. So after checking the message board and determining that they could do without him for a day, Cloud set about to find the elusive man. Of course, with no idea of where to start, he had no other choice than to reach out again and brush tentatively along the alien connection. As little as he liked it, it was useful just now. There was an answering echo, a sense of focused attention, the feel of pages under fingertips, tall stacks of books towering overhead. Opening his eyes again, Cloud headed for the elevators. He should have guessed, really, that Sephiroth would be holed up in the library again. He was halfway across the lounge area when he heard voices ahead down the hall. A group of soldiers approaching from the elevators, having just arrived for their morning duties. Cloud immediately changed directions, heading for the door to the stairwell as quickly as was natural. He didn't want to get caught up just now in anyone else's business, and many of the soldiers seemed to think he was an admirable replacement for Zack in terms of doling out advice and training opportunities despite his newness to the rank. The door clicked shut behind him without any outcry, and Cloud let his shoulders relax a bit. The identical staircase passed quickly as he jogged up the steps. This route only went up to the 60th floor, where he had to pass through what the soldiers lovingly called Dead Man's Land. No one important needed to take the elevators that stopped at this level, thus it was rarely used for foot traffic. Instead, it was used as a punishment shift for soldiers and troopers alike, infamous in how boring it was. Luckily, it was a pair of miserable-looking troopers on duty. They started at his appearance, having clearly been in the middle of a card game, but Cloud merely waved at them as he crossed the floor to the special staircase to the upper levels. The Shinra building had one of the most confusing layouts, but he supposed it did deter invasion somewhat. Everything Shinra considered important was above this level: the executives, the science division, and the president's office. His steps sped up the closer he got to his goal, impatience and nerves driving him on as relentlessly as the quiet buzz in his mind. He paused briefly at the door to the 67th floor, pulling out Zack's access card to scan against the reader. Officially, he didn't have access to this floor, but as a first, Zack did, and he'd left his keycards on the side table next to the couch for Cloud to use. The smell of many books in a crowded space invaded Cloud's senses as he stepped out. This floor was almost entirely devoted to the stacks of books, only the mayor's small office free of them. Cloud was fairly sure no one else would be on this floor. As before, Sephiroth researched alone, isolated from the rest of the world, as he sought answers, Cloud supposed. He let his feet carry him automatically, following the invisible pull, to one of the rooms. The door slid open, giving him the view of Sephiroth standing by the far bookshelf, a large tome in his hand that he was studying intently. The image of Sephiroth among the bookshelves superimposed for a moment with another scene, similar in their content, though one was fabricated from Cloud's mind. He'd never actually witnessed Sephiroth in the Nibelheim Mansion library, but he could recall the details vividly. Sometimes he wondered if part of that Zack hadn't really entered him, attached itself, and rewritten parts of Cloud's mind to protect and guide him. Or maybe it was more mind games from the other. Either way, it unsettled Cloud enough to take the final few steps into the room. Now that he was here, he realized he had no plan. He needed to distract Sephiroth, to get him from the confines of the library, and maybe it was also that Cloud was curious, wanted to spend just a little more time with the enigma Sephiroth presented, danger aside. Speaking of danger, Cloud found he suddenly had to duck, as Sephiroth whirled around and threw the book he'd been holding at him. He wore a faint scowl that turned to momentary surprise when his eyes landed on Cloud. A second later, his face blank.
"What are you doing here?"
Straightening, Cloud glanced over his shoulder at the book where it lay face down, pages crumpled, before turning back to Sephiroth.
I was looking for you.
He'd start with the truth and see where it went from there. Sephiroth's eyes narrowed.
Why?
He'd sounded genuinely baffled. Crossing his arms, Cloud regarded Sephiroth silently for a few minutes. Why was complicated, yet also not. He was always searching for Sephiroth, one way or another. This time, though, he knew what he'd really been after.
To spar. Do you want to?
He needed the exercise, without the politics, without playing mentor to the other soldiers, and he knew Sephiroth needed the distraction as well. He needed to distract Sephiroth, to keep him from finding the answers he didn't want to know.
You should leave,
Sephiroth said, turning back to the shelf he'd been standing before.
I have research to do.
Ignoring the dismissal, Cloud shook his head.
Are you avoiding me?
Even through his defenses, Cloud could feel the flash of irritation-anger that pulsed from Sephiroth's mind.
Why should I? Why are you?
So long as they were asking rhetorical questions. Sephiroth glanced over his shoulder, glaring icily through the fall of his bangs.
Do you really think you're that important? No.
Cloud shrugged. He was tired of importance, of trying to quantify every little move against what others were thinking, what they'd do, what he knew they might.
Does that matter?
What did Sephiroth consider important? In a sudden movement, Sephiroth's hand jerked up and ran through his long bangs. He turned on his heel and stalked towards Cloud, only stopping when he was looming over him. His mouth was twisted in agitation.
I don't understand you,
he bit out, words clipped. It was the most animated Cloud had seen him since the fight with the simulated behemoth. He'd been angry and confused then, too, and it had shown in his impatience to get away. Maybe, Cloud realized, Sephiroth did that as well, ran away until there was nowhere else to go. But instead of having friends to help him when he reached the end, he was alone. Sephiroth had had friends once, even if he refused to acknowledge that relationship now. They had abandoned him, whether or not that had been their goal or intention, and Sephiroth didn't know how to reach back. It made it easy to remember how different Sephiroth was now, how much Cloud wanted to prevent what he could become.
Do you want to?
The question echoed something Zack had said to him once, that it had sounded like Cloud wanted to be closer, to be friends with Sephiroth. Sephiroth stared at him, his eyes tracking back and forth as he examined Cloud's face. He was close enough to see the way Sephiroth's slitted pupils expanded and contracted. Echoing himself, Sephiroth asked,
Why should I?
Narrowing his eyes slightly, Cloud pointed out,
You keep asking that. You have to answer it yourself. The answer is easy,
Sephiroth said, and his expression relaxed slightly, the pinched look leaving his mouth and eyes, his brows relaxing.
The truth is harder.
Cloud nodded in acknowledgement. He looked around the small library again, feeling claustrophobic among the endless shelves of books, and shook his head again.
So, do you want to spar?
If not, Cloud was fully prepared to be an annoyance, until Sephiroth came at him anyway. Sephiroth's lips pressed into a thin line, and that pause that Cloud had begun to realize indicated indecision and hesitance appeared again. After a moment, Sephiroth let out a huff of a breath and said,
I will need to retrieve Masamune.
It was only then that Cloud realized the absence of the blade, and he froze for a moment longer. Had he really become so comfortable that he hadn't noticed? He'd come here on edge, but had fallen into a sense of ease when Sephiroth had retracted emotionally. It emphasized how human he was. That, above all, had let Cloud slip unconsciously into a relaxed state of mind.
Yeah,
he said belatedly, realizing a response was needed. He took a few steps back, away from Sephiroth's towering presence. Then again, he hadn't thought twice about the proximity of the other man, when it was so dangerous to be that close. He forced himself to relax his shoulders, but tensed again as Sephiroth stepped forward, easily closing the distance Cloud had put between them. He bristled defensively, wondering what Sephiroth was up to now.
What?
He demanded.
You're in the way.
Sephiroth's eyes moved over his shoulder to the door behind him, and the corner of his mouth ticked upward slightly in amusement. His eyes dropped back to Cloud.
Did you want to spar or not?
Stepping to the side, Cloud ducked his head automatically before remembering his lack of scarf. He let out an exasperated breath.
Yes. Do you want me to meet you?
He trailed off, unsure if Sephiroth would be more inclined to use the training room, or if he frequented the abandoned roads more. Sephiroth tilted his head.
Training room. Or we'll need to leave Midgar. I'm not allowed to use the fields at the compound. Too much collateral damage.
The corner of his mouth twitched up in a grin at that admission, and Cloud felt the stirrings of desire for a real challenge.
Outside Midgar, then.
If it also got Sephiroth away from the library for longer, that was just a bonus.
I'll meet you near the exit in the Sector 7 slums.
Nodding, silver hair sliding over his pauldrons, Sephiroth swept out of the room. Cloud hesitated before stooping down and scooping up the discarded book. He smoothed the pages, flipping through a few as he took in the information on materia production and its military uses. Snapping it closed, he tossed it negligently on the table nearby. Maybe he should suggest Sephiroth bring Viri.
Year 0002, August 24th. As your seniors, it's our duty to guide you into smoothly integrating into your new position in Soldier,
Edge said, smirking from his spot at Cloud's side. He had Cloud's arm in a tight grip, lifting him up a few inches. From Cloud's other side, Gibbs mirrored the grip, leaving Cloud's boots barely touching the ground.
Though really, it's just hard to pin you down. So we're not giving you a choice. Mission's already assigned to the three of us.
Resisting the urge to kick them hard enough to make them let go, Cloud snapped,
Why doesn't anyone ask first? I didn't refuse. It worked well enough for Caffrey.
Edge replied cheerfully. Huffing, Cloud heaved himself forward and solidly onto his feet again, pulling Edge and Gibbs off balance as he did so. It wasn't the first time Gibbs and Edge had ambushed him this way either, though the first time they'd approached him since his promotion. It was easy then to shrug off their grip and step forward, and he brushed absently at his shirt as he turned back to the two undaunted thirds.
What mission?
Edge sauntered up beside him again, his thumbs hooked into one of his belts.
Some griffins are trying to nest into the construction zone out in Sector 3.
His grin turned sharp.
Ever since that trip to Medeal, I've wanted to kick the ass of anything feathery that doesn't walk. This should be fun.
Gibbs groaned behind Cloud.
He's not kidding. I've been on so many missions to wipe out everything from coast runners to Raijinchos and their relatives. That, and I've collected enough feathers to make a new pillow and mattress. At least you sleep more comfortably at night.
Edge shot back, absently listening to them banter. Cloud pulled out his phone and thumbed through the menus. Sure enough, he did have a notification for a mission assignment. He hadn't noticed the alert go off. Scanning the details quickly, he closed his phone and slipped it away. turning on his heel to head for the elevators. They had ambushed him almost as soon as he got off, obviously waiting for this opportunity. It didn't bother him, aside from the unnecessary manhandling. He enjoyed hanging out with Edge and Gibbs.
Not even a buy your leave, Cloud?
Edge said, stepping up beside him as they waited for the elevator car to arrive.
I thought asking was optional.
Cloud countered, raising a sardonic eyebrow.
Only if you're born behind a barn like Edge.
Gibbs muttered, sotto voce. Cloud shook his head.
And yet you go ahead with all his schemes anyway.
Gibbs clapped Cloud roughly on the shoulder.
And you go along with Sax.
Point.
Think that's why they like to pair us up? A soldier alone is trouble, but two's a party? So what does that make 3?
Edge asked, pushing at Cloud and Gibbs' shoulders as the elevator doors opened. Rubbing at his stubble, Gibbs said,
I think they pair us up because someone needs to keep their head and remember which part of the sword goes in the monster and which end you hold. Now you're getting into advanced classes.
Cloud leaned back against the elevator wall and watched them banter from under the brim of his helmet. Along with his new rank came the new headgear, though lately he'd begun to regret the necessity of wearing it. Maybe he could lose this one as well. He already forgot it half the time. If you asked him, they paired soldiers up to keep them sane. Without an outlet, without someone who understood and knew what it was like to have a constant restless feeling buzzing through your body, you were left with an unstable disaster waiting to happen. Soldiers were always on duty because returning to a normal life was almost impossible. For those that tried, well, Cloud was a perfect example of all the ways it could go wrong. Sephiroth was another. The challenge there was in getting him to try to realize that he couldn't handle everything alone. He'd been alone for too long as it was. Unsurprisingly, Cloud's thoughts always returned to him, which had only become worse after he'd sought him out in the library the other day. The spa had been a release from the tension of the past few weeks, a way for Cloud to let loose some of the frustration and anger, and at the same time it was enjoyable to match swords with Sephiroth, to see how much his training had paid off and improved him. Another part of him missed doing the same with Zack, but Sephiroth provided a thrill that his friend couldn't match. After that, it had been an exercise in restraint not to just seek Sephiroth out daily and let Shinra rot. The main thing holding him back was that he was positive Sephiroth wouldn't put up with it for long, even if he enjoyed their spa as well. Once they were out on the streets of Midgar, Gibbs took the lead. Though Edge was the tallest of them, Gibbs' stocky build cut through the crowds far more easily. Cloud was more used to weaving between people, but like this, the crowd parted for the 3 of them instead. It was about the same effect as having Zack there to bulldoze the path for him. It wasn't long before they passed into the noisier areas around the construction zone, where the sounds of people gave way to the sounds of machinery and the shouts of men at work. They passed under the looming skeletons of scaffolding, heading further along towards the fringes of the unfinished plate. It was there that Gibbs stopped to have a word with a gathering of construction workers who were seated on a pile of girders, looking irritated and bored.
Finally!
The foreman spat, chewing on the butt of a cigarette he had.
Was wondering when you lot would show up.
Edge snagged Cloud's arm and pulled him away to the sound of the foreman's grumbling about schedules and being unable to get his work done.
Leave the people minding to Gibbs. He'll join us once he's done soothing the clientele. I want to have a look at these feather bags.
Edge grimaced as they reached the edge of the construction zone.
Goddamn heights.
Without another word, he jumped from solid ground onto one of the long, steel beams sticking out from the incomplete plate. He wobbled a bit on the landing and kept his helmeted head tilted determinedly upward as he jumped for the next one up. Suppressing an amused grin, Cloud gathered himself to leap up after, pushing off of each beam to take himself higher and higher up the structure. He caught up with Edge easily, craning his neck around to try and get an angle on where the monsters were nesting. There were signs all over, gouges even in the steel beams, a few stray feathers gathered in corners where the wind blew them. The scaffolding itself spread out like another city block, half-finished buildings among the towering beams, partially completed roads cutting off abruptly to reveal parts of the plate left bare. When he reached the highest part of the scaffolding, Cloud paused, one hand resting against the beam perpendicular to the one he was standing on. The top of it only barely reached above his head. The wind was stronger up here, buffeting at his clothes as it tried to tug him from his perch. Nearby, an abandoned harness swung, still attached to the building despite its owner's absence. A scuff below him drew Cloud's attention down, where Edge had stopped on a lower level. Even from here, Cloud could see his face had paled. He could sympathize. There were still times when he was in a vehicle that was too enclosed, or a ride that was too rough, that Cloud would get a phantom feeling of nausea he used to experience. Below, he could see Gibbs beginning his ascent, climbing the structure in shorter, more controlled leaps. It didn't take him long to reach their height, and he paused next to Edge. Cloud couldn't hear what was said over the whistling of the wind, but a moment later, Gibbs gave him a jaunty wave. Snorting softly, Cloud turned his attention back to the horizon, scanning the area again for any strange movement. With a low shriek, a large shape launched itself from one of the nearby scaffolds and winged into the air. It circled, steadily widening the area it covered in an obvious patrol. Cloud tracked its progression with his eyes until a sharp whistle drew his attention down to Gibbs and Edge. Gibbs waved an arm, beckoning him down, then cupped his hands. Nodding, Cloud let go of his support, leaping down at the pair of thirds. Edge crouched next to Gibbs, boots spread wide on the beam, and cupped his hands as well. Cloud landed boots first in their hands, then braced himself as they heaved him upward in tandem. The combined effort took him easily high enough to where the griffin circled overhead. In a singular motion, Cloud drew his sword and lashed out, colliding with the monster in a clash of flashing talons and a piercing shriek of protest. His blow struck true, sinking into the griffin's chest and piercing the heart, killing the beast. Their momentum carried Cloud a little further, and he let the heavy body slide off his sword to fall wetly through the scaffolding to the distant ground below. Gravity pulled Cloud down as well, and he landed further out on one of the jutting struts with a quiet grunt of effort. Like gunshots had set them off, more bodies began rising from the half-finished buildings. As a whole rookery of griffins took wing in reaction to the death of their fellow, Cloud felt his mouth pull into a tight grin as the high of battle began to rush through him. With a faint hup, Edge landed nearby, and Gibbs came following after.
"Watch your step, lads,"
Edge said, grin wickedly sharp as he reached back to grip the hilt of his sword.
"The battleground's a bit tricky."
"Lure them low," Cloud suggested, gesturing at the scaffolding below them.
"They can maneuver it, but it gives us the advantage." "Sure, if you can get one to follow you,"
Gibbs agreed amiably, tipping his helmet back slightly with one finger to wink at Cloud.
"Need another boost?"
Edge let out a bark of laughter, drawing his sword with one hand and gesturing down.
"We'll back you up."
Nodding, Cloud sheathed his sword and leapt at Gibbs at the same time Edge dropped off the edge of the beam, making his way back into the heart of the scaffolding. Once again, Gibbs cupped his hands and boosted Cloud into the air easily. Cloud had a brief glimpse of him following after Edge, before he had to turn his attention to the fluttering mass that filled the sky. The griffins had stirred themselves into a frenzy, wheeling and diving among themselves as they shrieked and wailed their agitation. One pair collided briefly, talons slashing at each other, before they broke apart to wheel away in opposite directions. Angling his body, Cloud flipped himself around, slowing his ascent before he came close enough to catch the attention of the entire flock. He let a burst of power flow into his materia, clenching his fists for a moment before thrusting his hand out. Fingers spread, aiding the thunderspell's direction as he cast it at the nearest griffin. They were resistant to most magic, but it did the job of catching the monster's attention. One beady black eye focused on Cloud, and with a gaping shriek, it broke of its circle and dove after him. Flipping again, Cloud gauged how long it would take him to fall onto the scaffolding versus the creature's dive, and refrained from pulling his sword out. Just as the griffin was inches away, it had to furl its wings and tuck its claws back to dive through the opening in the scaffolding after Cloud. He used the moment to kick off a passing beam, redirecting his momentum to a horizontal dash with a few more leaps. As he predicted, though hindered, the griffin was able to keep up with him in their chase, flaring open its wings in the spaces between beams for a boost of speed, digging its talons into the beams to leap off them when it had to. Ahead, Cloud saw the bulk of Gibbs leaning out from one of the vertical struts, arm outstretched. Cloud didn't slow, and his momentum when he clasped arms with Gibbs swung them both around the beam, Gibbs's grip on it acting as a pivot point to arrest Cloud's headlong charge. The griffin had no way to change directions that quickly, and a second later it didn't matter, as Edge slammed into it from the side, sending it tumbling away. It struck several beams as its momentum spun it out of control, and with a final crack, the body went limp, coming to rest half-draped over a horizontal beam a moment later. Edge hopped up next to Gibbs and Cloud, grinning smugly. An expression that dropped quickly, and with a pointed, "Oh, hell!" With a raucous squabbling, the rest of the flock came pouring in through the scaffolding. Cloud laughed as he leapt away, drawing his sword and beginning another game of tag with the handful that broke off after him. Through the gaps between the beams, Cloud could see Gibbs and Edge moving adjacent to him, leaping from one to the next with the rest of the beasts hot on their tail. Grabbing a vertical strut, he swung himself around it, kicking out and slamming his boot in the side of the leading griffin's head. It screeched and hit an I-beam with a sickening crunch. Boots ringing against the metal, Cloud dropped to a lower level and took off in the opposite direction. He had to twist to the side, bringing his blade around defensively as he dodged a rain of feather projectiles. One slipped through his defenses, scoring a shallow line in his bicep. Superficial as it was easily ignorable despite the mild sting. A whistling sound had him bounding out of the way of another's breath attack, the heated projectile striking a vertical beam, turning it red as the metal melted and dripped. The next few minutes were a blur of movement, as Cloud kept away from his myriad of attackers, striking where he could, but mostly keeping them moving through the structure as fast as they could chase him. He passed Gibbs briefly, the other third giving a whoop as he outmaneuvered a pair of griffins into colliding headfirst into each other. The pair of monsters tumbled a few floors, squabbling as they tried to untangle themselves, and they crashed through the top of a half-finished building. Cloud winced at the damage, aware that they were to protect the site from monster damage, not cause more of it. A rush of wings announced the arrival of a griffin, clawing for his head. A second before its claws raked down his back, Cloud ducked forward, bracing his hands against the beams he'd been standing on as he kicked out to knock the monster off target. Before he could follow up, Edge crashed into the beast from above, sword first, and vaulted off its back to land on a nearby shaky platform. Immediately the wood slid a couple of inches, dislodged from its resting place by a couple 100 pounds, crashing into it a way it wasn't designed for. It slipped, falling out from beneath Edge's feet, and left him cursing and clinging inelegantly to a nearby strut. Seeing no immediate danger around them, Cloud shifted his grip on his sword and crouched down to grin at Edge.
Need a hand? I've got two, thanks.
A raucous scream drowned out Cloud's chuckle as a griffin came at them from below. But before either of them could move, Gibbs appeared sans sword and lashed out with his fists. He struck it right across its beak, knocking it out and sending it tumbling back down. Gibbs landed a few feet away, shaking out his hand ruefully.
Jen's gonna give it to me if I show up with split knuckles again.
Edge grunted.
You'll heal fast, you pansy.
Looking around their impromptu battlefield, Cloud scanned for any sign of movement among the scaffolding. There was nothing but the occasional sway of leftover equipment that had been abandoned by the workers when the monsters had first taken roost. Frowning, he asked,
Where did they all go? Maybe they flew up your...
Cloud let a lick of power flow into his materia as he touched the metal beam, and the thunder spell raced eagerly along it to shock Edge right off his perch. Ignoring the stream of cursing, he craned his head up to peer into the sky through the crisscrossed beams above them. There were bodies up there, darting this way and that, as well as... Duck, Cloud warned, before taking his own advice and swinging off the side of the beam he'd been standing on, dangling under it as a rain of molten metal fell around him. The griffins were firing their breath weapons into the scaffolding, clearly having decided to regroup out of the reach of their hit-and-run tactics. When the soft hiss and patter died off, he swung himself back up, sheathing the sword briefly as he turned to Gibbs and Edge.
We should finish this up before they destroy too much.
Gibbs ran his gloved fist against his cheek, rubbing at a burn mark before he grinned ruefully.
It would really suck not getting paid because a few feather dusters got the drop on us. What's the plan? Do we ever have a plan?
Edge complained, shaking out fists that still sparked with the occasional electric crackle.
Just throw Cloud at them until they stop moving has my vote. Hey, let's not get...
Gibbs began, before Cloud cut him off.
Okay. Really?
Edge looked maliciously gleeful at the prospect. Shrugging, Cloud shook his head.
Why not? Okay, fine, you two.
Gibbs laughed, throwing his hands up in surrender.
See you at the top.
He let the last word snap significantly, before he put his words to practice and began heading up towards the open sky. Edge scowled after him, then at Cloud when he let out a brief chuckle.
It's better now, right?
Cloud pointed out, before following after Gibbs. That seemed to be a common trait among soldiers. Whatever holdover fears or symptoms they had from before being enhanced went away when they got distracted. Zack was the same, all nervous energy until he got involved in something physical. It only took them a few moments to make it to the top level, avoiding the parts of the scaffolding that still glowed red from the attack from before. The sky was filled with darting, diving, milling bodies of the griffins. Despite their exercise, there were still a good many of them left, and this time they weren't coming in close. The moment they caught sight of the three, the griffins broke off their random attacks into the scaffolding and began sweeping around to focus on them. Cloud didn't wait for the first attack, instead bracing himself to leap at Edge, who hefted him into the air as promised. At the same time, Cloud activated the materia in his sword bracer, and flames licked to life along the blade. They aided in his first attack against the leading monster, as he braced himself briefly on its back as he struck home, before leaping off to keep his airborne momentum going. A griffin twisted out of the way of his next strike, and Cloud was forced to block it with his blade as its claws flashed close to his face. He could feel the heat from his own weapon, though it didn't seem to bother the griffin overly much as it clamped down on the blade and tried to wrench it from his grasp. Worried for a moment the blade might break, again, if he allowed the game of tug-of-war, Cloud braced his feet, one against the underside of the griffin's body, and the other catching it under the upsweep of a wing. He kicked and pulled out of its grip at the same time. It shrieked as it tumbled through the air, regaining itself with a few heavy flaps of its wings to circle back up into the swarming flock. The move made Cloud drop down again, and he angled himself so that Gibbs below him was able to springboard him back up into the fight. As he arched upwards, he could see Edge taking out an enterprising griffin that had tried to dive at him. That gave Cloud a thought, and he let the energy fade out of his blade as he quickly sheathed it, already activating one of the other materia in his bracer. He bowled right into the first griffin, knocking it backwards in the air as he released the stop spell. Its cry was cut off as the spell took hold, freezing it in the brief moment of time, and without the aid of its wings it immediately began to plummet. Cloud used the body briefly to kick off higher towards a new target, leaving it to tumble down where Edge and Gibbs waited. The next few monsters met the same fate before Cloud ran out of immediately reachable foes. He let gravity carry him down with the last griffin, leaping away and over to Edge just before Gibbs charged in to dispatch it. As Edge braced against Cloud's weight, he didn't immediately heave up, taking a moment to smirk at Cloud.
Come on, hotshot, finish with a bang.
Cloud's hum of acknowledgement went unheard over the rush of wind as he was tossed upward again. He flipped as he rose, a deceptively slow tumble as he came level with the majority of the rest of the flock. There were, he saw at a quick glance, 4 of the beasts left. Gathering his power, Cloud could feel his hair whip in the rush of energy as he drew his sword, slashing forward at the center mass. The release of power slammed into the leading griffin, cleaving it cleanly in 2. Other shockwaves branched out to strike at the nearby 3 monsters. One was struck at a wing joint, ripping it clean off the griffin's body and sending it spiraling out of control towards the ground. Another caught one in the throat, cutting deeply into the jugular vein in a spray of blood. It too fell limply out of the air. The last avoided most of the attack, only a score on its feathered flank showing Cloud's effort. It dove at him with a shriek, wings stretching behind it and claws extended to sink into his body. Cloud thrust a hand forward quickly and cast 2 spells in quick succession, narrowly missing getting his arm bitten as he jerked it back out of reach and twisted to avoid the swoop. He stared in surprise as the spells disappeared down the griffin's throat, swallowed as its momentum carried it past Cloud. Wincing, he watched it bank to come around at him again as he fell, only for it to suddenly expand outward in a shower of blood and gore as the stop-fire combo went off inside it, erupting out of the body cavity in a bloom of flames. Cloud landed with a light grunt, sheathing his sword as he waited to be rejoined by his companions. Edge was too busy laughing, clinging to one of the vertical struts as he wheezed at Gibbs, who was wiping bits of griffin off his shoulders and helmet. He'd unfortunately been right under the last monster when Cloud's spells had gone off, and hadn't gotten out of the way in time. Edge collected himself enough to cup one hand against his mouth, hollering across at Cloud.
That was a blast!
Before he dissolved back into laughter.
I know where you sleep.
Gibbs bellowed back.
Oh God, it's in my mouth! Cloud! Sorry.
He called back insincerely. It hadn't been his intention, but the results couldn't be argued with. All the griffins were dead now. Except one, as they discovered, upon reaching plate level again. It was the one Gibbs had bare-fisted. Still breathing, it was sprawled in a pile of debris, possibly what had slowed its descent enough for it to survive. Edge rubbed his hands together eagerly.
Okay, I have an idea. No,
Gibbs said immediately, but it was clear that Edge wasn't listening. Cloud just sighed.
Year 0002, August 27th.
The cafeteria was lively at this midday hour, many of the soldiers taking the opportunity to break from their morning duties and prepare for the afternoon ones. Cloud was poking disinterestedly through a plate of some noodle dish he'd picked randomly, listening absently to his table companions as they complained about their upcoming mission.
I hate babysitting jobs,
Jonas groaned, shoving his plate across the table and slumping down with a grunt.
We have to escort some scientists to Corral. Why do we have to deal with this bullshit? Something weird was excavated, I heard. Of course they'd send someone out to take a look.
Byron, another third and apparently Jonas's partner for the mission, said mildly, resting his chin on his hands as he regarded Jonas dispassionately. Cloud looked up in surprise. It took him a moment to remember that Corral's initial destruction hadn't happened yet. His stomach tightened as he realized that somewhere out there, Barrett was working hard for his future, unaware of the tragedy that awaited him in just a few short years. When he corrected themselves, they broke away from Shinra, when they were able to pull Sephiroth from his path to madness, Cloud promised himself he'd prevent Corral's destruction somehow. Jonas sighed, pushing back against the table as he tilted his chair back on two legs, rocking precariously from side to side.
I know, and we need to log a mission today. And there was nothing else on the board that was any better. I don't have to like it, though.
He leaned forward suddenly, his chair hitting the ground with a loud thump as he regarded Cloud earnestly.
Hey, Cloud, we're allowed to request a few troops for backup. Got any suggestions?
Tilting his head, Cloud thought for a moment before nodding.
Jack Howell and Sparrow Kinley from Unit 20. Sparrow is good at those kind of missions, and Jack is solid backup.
More than that, Cloud was curious what was going on in Corral right now, and he could ask them upon their return to get a better idea for future action. Byron grunted, nodding sharply as he heaved himself to his feet.
Thanks. It's nice to have a good recommendation. Some of those troopers are, well, weak, frankly. Worse than useless,
Jonas agreed with a laugh.
What can you expect from the regular army, though?
You can expect them to have your back, Cloud said sharply,
and you can expect them to do their job.
The arrogance of the two wasn't unusual for soldiers, who often forgot their own humble roots.
Strength isn't the only thing to contribute.
He kept his face blank as he felt a familiar buzz approaching. A surprised hush had fallen over the rest of the room, though his table mates hadn't seemed to notice. Sephiroth prowled to a halt behind the pair and gazed down at them with his usual indifferent facial expression.
And a soldier who can't utilize his men properly isn't much of a soldier,
he said, announcing his arrival. Cloud hid a grin in his fist as he propped his chin on his hand at the way the two all but leapt out of their skin.
Sir!
Jonas yelped, trying to stand, turn around and salute all at once. He tripped over himself, falling heavily back into his seat with a stifled curse. Byron had more luck, having already stood up, but he had a poorly disguised look of panic on his face.
Don't you two have some troopers to find?
Cloud asked, taking pity and giving them an excuse to leave.
Sir!
Jonas said again, and Cloud shook his head in amusement as they hurried away as fast as they could, short of running. He tilted his head up to get a better look at Sephiroth's face, raising an eyebrow inquiringly. Sephiroth slid into one of the vacated seats, in a rustle of leather, as if he did this every day, and idly folded his hands on top of the table.
You enjoy carelessly turning all of my efforts to futility, don't you?
Brow furling in confusion, Cloud gave Sephiroth a baffled look.
What?
Normally he was better at deciphering Sephiroth's cryptic comments, but he had no context at all in this case. There wasn't any strong emotion buzzing across their link either, even when Cloud cautiously relaxed his mental defenses for a moment to check. Sephiroth shifted and drew one hand up and rested his cheek against his knuckles, silver hair slithering down to pool on the table. With the other, he retrieved a folded sheet of paper and pushed it across the table to Cloud.
I took a few notes on Viri's progress.
Blinking, Cloud leaned forward, glancing for permission before pulling the sheet closer to him to read. He was entirely unsurprised at the perfectly neat handwriting, and much more interested in what was written. There was a detailed list of the types of materia and combinations Sephiroth had tried, date and time in neat notations next to each attempt, as well as a short summary of the results. Further down were notes on Viri's intelligence, the results of some of the comprehension tests that ranged from identifying shapes and colors to following more and more complex instructions. Humming softly and frowning to himself, Cloud took his time to read over what was written, making a few mental notes for the next time he took Viri out for his racing paces.
Do you have a pencil?
He asked absently, tapping a finger on an entry of Viri disobeying an order. Mostly he found Viri to be very responsive to commands, so it was an anomaly he'd like to explore. Without a word, Sephiroth pulled one out of his pocket, sliding it across into Cloud's line of sight. Cloud took it, not looking up as he began to scribble some of his own observations in the margins. He flipped the sheet over, adding in Viri's progress in his physical prowess, and what sort of improvements could be expected if he kept up the exercise.
I was wondering if he'd take to some sort of support spells, if I could show him their benefits during our runs,
he murmured, tapping the eraser against the table and looking up at Sephiroth again. Sephiroth gave a nonchalant shrug, his keen gaze never wavering from Cloud.
You may try them on him. He picks things up fast, so long as you show him first, as well as give him a taste of the magic. Have you made any progress in curbing his preference for thunder? No.
Cloud heard the distinct sound of fingers strumming lightly on the table.
I'm hoping teaching him to use multiple equipped materia may help break the habit.
Cloud hummed again.
You might just eliminate it for a time from his equipment. If allowed to continue, it might be detrimental to him listening to what you say. I think that's what's happening here,
he added, pointing out the entry where Viri balked entirely at taking out targets using an ice materia.
He's well behaved overall, so it won't be difficult to continue that trend regardless. I'll switch to using thunder as an incentive. He works well with a reward-based system.
Abruptly, Cloud was aware of the complete silence of the room that should have been full of the bustle of other soldiers. Glancing around, he took note of the almost comic stillness as everyone's attention was solely on them. 1/3 even caught with his fork halfway to his gaping mouth as he stared. Frowning, Cloud ducked his head down under the pretense of reading the sheet again, unable to ignore the attention now that he was aware of it. It reminded him of how isolated Sephiroth really was. While his presence in the cafeteria was unusual, it shouldn't cause so much disruption that people couldn't function in their perplexion. A distant memory rose in Cloud's mind of a damnable inch of space and how much it had bothered him even then. He pushed down the bitter anger. It was attitudes such as this that had been driving Sephiroth into a corner. While Sephiroth himself didn't help the matter, it was easy to see why he had so easily given in to the idea that he was above humanity itself when he was treated exactly like that. Cloud's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice, and he looked up as Kundal approached the table.
Hey Cloud, Sephiroth, sir.
Just like that, the bitter regret was wiped away with surprise at Kunzel's casual but polite greeting. Across from him, Sephiroth glanced over his shoulder and gave a short nod of acknowledgement.
Soldier Kunzel. Mind if I join you guys?
Without waiting for an answer, Kunzel drew out the chair next to Sephiroth, spinning it around so he could straddle it as he sagged bonelessly against the back.
You wouldn't believe the commotion that went on in the soldier compound this morning.
He eyed Cloud suspiciously.
Or maybe you would.
Keeping his face blank, Cloud merely raised an eyebrow.
I left early. Sure,
Kunzel said, bobbing his head. He dropped the slim manila folder he'd been carrying on the table and gave it a shove so that it slid over to Sephiroth.
Incident report for our prestigious leader. Damage claims have already been submitted by those who were affected.
Sephiroth slid a gloved finger beneath one wing of the folder and flipped it open to skim the contents.
I'll make certain it's delivered later.
With a faint sound that may have been a sigh, he flipped it closed again and rose from his seat. Sephiroth held out his hand, looking expectantly at Cloud. Refolding the paper, Cloud handed the sheet of notes back to him, eyes lingering on his own clipped handwriting as Sephiroth tucked it away. He swept his gaze across the table, stopping briefly on both Kunzel and Cloud, where he lingered a moment, then offered,
Training room tomorrow?
Cloud nodded, and without another word, Sephiroth swept off. Fingers twitching against the tabletop, he fought down disappointment at Sephiroth's retreating form. He had other questions he wanted to ask, the concept of material-wielding chocobo still fascinating to him. Appetite gone, Cloud pushed himself to his feet and collected his half-eaten lunch. He heard a chair scrape behind him as Kunzel followed, and the room finally dissolved into a riot of hushed and not-so-hushed whispers as the other soldiers unfroze themselves. Resisting the urge to roll his eyes, Cloud paused after disposing of his trash to let Kunzel drop into step beside him, and they both headed for the doors to the hallway. Just as they reached them, the doors swung inward, heralding the entrance of Renault's jaunty saunter, followed by Rude's silent presence. Cloud immediately frowned, locking glares with Renault as the Turk noticed him. Renault sneered, sticking his tongue out, and Cloud bristled at the childish move. Before he could retaliate, he was shoved hard from behind as Kunzel all but marched him out.
Now, you don't want it getting back to Sephiroth that the prospective is starting fights right after he turns his back, do we?
Cloud shook off Kunzel's hand, stalking off down the hall to the elevators. He hit the button with more force than was necessary, crossing his arms as he waited for the car to arrive.
He's annoying,
he muttered when Kunzel caught up.
And a Turk.
Cloud just tisked in irritation. The elevator arrived a moment later, taking them to the soldier floor. They stepped out into the nearby empty lounge, only a second heading across it towards the mission board. Tilting his head to regard Kunzel, Cloud said,
Did you want something?
Kunzel led the way towards the back of the floor, past the training room, to a little niche with a table. The windows nearby showed a panorama of Midgar's skyline. Dropping down to sit on the bench, Kunzel leaned back against the table and braced his elbows on it.
I was looking for Sephiroth, and then I found him with you.
Easing himself into the bench next to him, Cloud raised a questioning eyebrow.
And? So he sought you out, huh? Yes,
Cloud said flatly. That seemed fairly obvious.
Going that well, then?
Sitting back with a sigh, Cloud stared blankly across the empty room.
I don't know.
There was no certainty when it came to Sephiroth, and Cloud was too scared to rely on the positive signs. No matter how much he wanted to believe that the tentative, strange interactions meant something, there was still too much of a gap between them. Too much unsaid that could never be said. His secrets could tear apart all the progress they made. Kunzel hummed low in his throat, and after a drawn-out moment said,
That was the first time I've seen him in the cafeteria since Angeal and Genesis deserted.
A surge of irritation struck Cloud at that.
I'm not them,
he said sharply.
Neither is Zack. We're not replacements. Obviously not. You're too short and he's too energetic.
Kunzel rolled his shoulders and neck, a crack sounding before he stretched out a little more loosely on the bench.
No one's going to replace them, even if you two do have eerie similarities. They left a hole in the program when they disappeared, and I don't doubt that's more true for anyone than Sephiroth.
He won't admit it, Cloud said with a shake of his head.
That's the problem. And Shinra is trying to make us replacements. It's too easy to get caught up.
Too easy to fall into the easy routine that Shinra life provided, with its conveniences and innovations that helped everyone who used them. Too easy to forget those luxuries and comforts came at the price of the planet, and many of the people as well.
There's one reason Sephiroth won't ever mistake you for Genesis. You know why?
Cloud tilted his head, regarding Kunzel silently for a moment. There was a myriad of reasons why, from the superficial physical looks to the differences in personality, but that didn't seem to be what Kunzel meant. Finally, he shook his head.
I don't know.
Reaching over, Kunzel clouded him on the shoulder.
You're better than he was.
That left Cloud stumped.
What? You heard me.
Narrowing his eyes, Cloud shook his head in confusion.
I thought everyone always talks about them like they were other, like Sephiroth.
He'd always assumed that Genesis and Angeal had been a step above the rest of the soldier. Maybe not Sephiroth's level, but then no one was. They were spoken of with reverence, despite their dishonorable, by Shinra standards, conduct at the end of their lives. Kunzel chuckled.
Yeah, but Zack beat him, didn't he?
Cloud drew one leg up, resting his chin on his knee. He knew that battles weren't just a matter of strength or skill, that sometimes desperation or determination could carry you through. The circumstances of Zack's battles were too complicated to reduce it down to such a simple statement. At the same time, though, he knew Zack was skilled, that he'd earned the right to first class through his strength and achievements. Beyond that, Cloud knew Zack, no matter which one, had something more in him that allowed him to triumph where others would fail. A strength of character that few could beat. He couldn't see how that applied to him, however. He'd told Kunzel he could beat Sephiroth, and if it came down to a fight, Cloud knew he'd have to. With Zack's help, they had a good chance of taking down Sephiroth before too much was damaged. But Kunzel had no real reason to believe Cloud's words. The only spar Cloud had had with Sephiroth that were public knowledge had ended by suspension, and it had been clear to Cloud that Sephiroth had only been testing at that time. Maybe Kunzel had a point. Sephiroth was drawn to strength, and if he perceived Cloud was something more than the other two who'd freely gone against him, that would certainly catch his attention.
I don't know if it's enough,
he said at last. That was, above all, what Cloud feared right now. That despite his second chance, despite Zack standing at his side, aware of the danger and prepared for it this time, that it was all for nothing, that Zack would still die, and Aerith and Sephiroth would choose to lose himself in madness.
Who knows? It's not like anyone can know what the future can bring,
Kunzel said with a light grin. Cloud felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth as he acknowledged Kunzel's unspoken jab. That was true. Cloud was the closest thing to knowing what the future would bring. Kunzel was telling him to trust himself more. Holding up his hands, Kunzel continued.
Besides, I'm just an informant. What you make of or do with the information I give you is up to you.
Cloud let out a huff of laughter.
We'll find out at Nibelheim,
he murmured, more to himself than his companion.
Sephiroth has changed.
Just a little, but... Still, the important thing is that he came to you, Kunzel said, and then he asked you to meet him in the training room. A flash of resentment left Cloud scowling, and he thumped his boot back on the floor and crossed his arm. They forbid us from sparring outside of Midgar now. The training room is the only place left. It grated to be restricted. He'd been able to ignore the feeling of claustrophobia and restlessness before, but it had intensified once that outlet had been closed off. He hadn't been down to the slums since. He wasn't ready to face Aerith just yet. Kunzel started laughing, a light, breathy sound. Sometimes you're just as dense as Zack. Flushing, Cloud waved a hand dismissively. Sorry. Changing topics without missing a beat, Kunzel breezily said, I heard you were on a griffin extermination mission recently. Did you know that one of them got into Building 2 in the soldier compound? Cloud rolled his eyes good-naturedly. I might have heard something about it. Before the fact. How long? Don't you know? I told you. I left early. They had it locked up in Leo's room when I left. Cloud grinned. I'm sure Edge was torn up about that. I doubt anyone was except his roommate. Bet Zack'll be sad he missed it. With a gusty sigh, Kunzel rocked forward onto his feet and stretched. The sound of the other soldiers returning to the floor floated to them, and a pair of thirds went jogging past on their way to the materia room. Looks like it's time to get back to work. You want me to show you a trick to dupe the mission board into letting you into higher-level missions? Yes, Cloud said immediately, rising quickly to his feet. Maybe one of them would give him an excuse to get out of Midgar as well. There was, after all, still time.